Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from New York with David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo. The latest headlines, key analysis, big interviews, and the stories that hit home on your days off.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. We're coming to you live from Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York. I'm Christina Ruffini.
I'm David Gura, alongside Lisa Mateo. It is Sunday, July the 12th. Welcome to our listeners and viewers across all our Bloomberg platforms, on radio, television, streaming, on Bloomberg.com, and on the Bloomberg Business app. And
we're going to start with some breaking news this morning. Senator Lindsey Graham died last night from what his office says was a, quote, brief and sudden illness. He was 71 years old. The senior senator from South Carolina was one of President Trump's closest congressional allies and had just returned from a trip to Ukraine. There he met with President Zelensky on Friday.
On Saturday night, emergency personnel responded to a call for cardiac arrest at Graham's home in Washington. That's according to NBC News, which obtained police scanner audio. President Trump leading the tributes, posting this overnight, quote, Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the greatest people and senators I've ever known, is dead. He was always working and was a true American patriot. Lindsey will be greatly missed. Details and arrangements to follow. So sad. Joining us now is Bloomberg congressional reporter Eric Wasson. And Eric, I want to start with this dynamic that was really kind of characteristic of Lindsey Graham. At a time of great isolationism in the Republican Party, he was an avowed interventionalist, traveling around the world. As Christina just mentioned, most recently in Ukraine, his passion was that. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about the role that he played in the U.S. Senate over his 4 terms in the Senate.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to say I'm shocked by this news. He was a very nice person in the hallway, very personable and friendly, and I'm very surprised and saddened by it. He was an interventionalist, much in the mold of Mitch McConnell and the late John McCain, a breed of Republican that seems to be phasing out in the America First era. He just announced a Russia sanctions bill that he's going to try to push in the Senate on Friday after a meeting with Vladimir Zelensky in Ukraine. Very much an interventionist, very much a war hawk. You know, he was very much in favor of the bombing of Iran, of trying to replace the regime there. Just a very assertive foreign policy voice that's going to leave that faction of the party without a very, very clear champion right now in the debates to come. Someone also a senior appropriator, someone who, fought to increase the military budget, as well as, leading one of the leaders on the massive Republican tax cuts that went through. So this is going to lead an opening in the Senate. I'm hearing from a source that Joe Wilson, the representative, senior representative on the House side, is very much interested in running for this seat. It'll be a special primary. And it could be appointed by Governor McMaster in the coming days. It's hard to see who else from the delegation could really unite the group. Nancy Mace and Ralph Norman are 2 other Republicans that are prominent in the delegation. They ran against each other for governor. So it's very much a developing story. But this is someone, one of the biggest personalities, biggest characters in the Senate, and he's going to be missed by his colleagues, I think.
And Joe Wilson, for those who are not familiar with him, I remember I wrote a piece back in 2009. He was the gentleman who shouted out "You lie" during Obama's joint address to Congress, which at the time was controversial for heated political rhetoric. How the ball has moved in that time. But I first met Lindsey Graham,
and his son is likely to be the next governor. Alan Wilson won the GOP primary, so it's the potential rise of the Wilson dynasty.
Be something to watch there. I mean, we were talking before we came on the air. I first met Senator Graham in 2016 when he was endorsing Jeb Bush for president and fighting very strongly against a candidate he didn't believe in, and that was Donald Trump. I pulled some quotes from him this morning in that era saying that Trump was reckless and he says things that don't make sense. Can you talk a little bit about Graham's political evolution and his evolving friendship with President Trump? Trump is quoted as saying he's one of his best friends. How did we get there?
It's been up and down, their relationship. Certainly Graham early on, I remember being at a big gala dinner in Washington where it was on C-SPAN where he made fun of President Trump. Then he became a backer. And then after the January 6th riots, he was very critical, even saying he's done with the president. I'm very upset with the way that was handled. This was the January 6th riot protesting Biden's victory that resulted in the beating up of cops. And then Graham went back into the fold. I think Graham always wanted to be in the mix, wanted to be influential, and he felt, it was his duty, especially given the views he had on Israel strong supporter of Israel, Iran, and the rest of the foreign policy portfolio to be influential and be close to the president. So I think, and he continued to push that even until his last dying breaths here, pushing this Russia sanctions bill that had been stalled for years, but saying that it was going to move forward on Friday to sort of try to force Vladimir Putin to make a peace in Ukraine.
Eric, last question here. Christina asking about that friendship, the evolution of that friendship. He was also a very useful person for President Trump to have in the U.S. Senate. He chaired the Judiciary Committee for many years and really worked quite ardently to enact what President Trump wanted to see. A lot more judges confirmed by that committee. Talk a bit about that, if you would, just the way that he executed the policy vision of this president.
Oh, I know. I think, he was chairman during the Brett Kavanaugh hearings, very much defending Kavanaugh, came under attacks for his behavior as a teenager, and that really set him up to be an ally again of President Trump. So I think he's always, he's a traditional conservative in many, many ways. Having fought for the tax cuts, even though he once was a deficit hawk and these tax cuts cost $4 trillion, he quickly got behind them and made them happen, by adjusting the way that they were accounted for. So, he was obviously someone who always fought to be at the center of everything. And I would say someone who actually believed in the free media. He was someone who talked to reporters who believed, that we're not the enemies of the people. And I did appreciate that.
All right, Eric Wasson, thank you so much for joining us. I know it was an early phone call from us, but it was quite a surprise overnight. Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, dead at 71. Thank you so much.
More breaking news overnight. The U.S. military hit 140 targets in Iran. New video released by CENTCOM showing dramatic explosions, saying it struck missile and drone sites, naval assets, ammunition storage facilities, and more. This coming after, it says, the Iranian Navy attacked a merchant ship passing through the Strait of Hormuz.
The Islamic Revolutionary Guards are fighting back this morning, saying they've targeted American assets across the Middle East. Abir Abu Omar is a Bloomberg Middle East correspondent. She's joining us now from Dubai. And Shannon Kingston is ABC News State Department reporter. She is joining us from Washington. Abir, I want to start with you. Do we have any kind of idea of what was hit overnight? I was seeing reports as we were coming in this morning of possibly the death of a child in Qatar, also strikes in Oman and elsewhere, maybe Jordan, throughout the region. What is the damage report as everyone's waking up today?
Yeah, good morning, guys. So we're hearing of these explosions happening across the Middle East, and these tit-for-tat attacks continue to happen. Now, they started at the beginning of this week, or the past week, should I say, when Iran targeted a Qatar-flagged ship in the Strait of Hormuz, and then the U.S. went on to attack Iran military targets there for 2 straight days. Now, it seemed to have calmed down throughout the end of last week, at least, especially after President Trump came out during the NATO summit and said that as far as he's concerned, the ceasefire is over. But then we heard some caveats from the people around him, but also from the Middle Eastern part of the world, where we heard the talks are set to continue despite that very strong escalation in the rhetoric. But then over the weekend, and especially today, this Cyprus-flagged ship was hit by Iran. We're hearing just at the top of your show, I was just following the news, we're seeing headlines across the Bloomberg terminal saying that Oman, which works alongside Iran to sort of monitor the Strait of Hormuz, said that it rescued 23 crew members of the GFS Galaxy after the incident. This is the Cyprus-flagged ship. And so the U.S., as David had mentioned, targeted 140 targets across Iran. Most of those military targets. Earlier in the week, it had targeted bridges. A dozen people or so were killed in Iran. Some 78 people were injured. And just this morning, we're hearing these sirens across the Middle East, in the UAE, in Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain. Christina, as you've mentioned as well, Qatar is saying that 3 people were injured, including a child. And so we're seeing this escalation in the rhetoric quite a bit this morning. It's still unclear if we're going to see a return to diplomacy, a return to those technical talks that were taking place up until a couple of weeks ago in Doha. But it seems that the situation is slightly a little bit more complicated, especially with Pete Hegseth saying that Iran will pay, and this is a quote from him, will pay for the damage that it had ensued on the Strait of Hormuz. Iran, on its own, saying that the Strait of Hormuz is shut and that no ships can make movement. So we're back to, I don't want to say square one, because we're not seeing a kinetic sort of warfare similar to what we've seen in March, but we're going back to a place that we didn't think we would be at after that MOU was signed just three and a half weeks ago.
Shannon, let me pick up on that point about these talks, the technical talks that were supposed to be underway this weekend. We know the Iranian foreign minister traveled to Oman. Seems unclear if there were any U.S. representatives who were there as well. What is your sense of the status of those, looking at the backdrop to all of this, the wide geography that Abir just mentioned a moment ago that's been hit overnight? What grounds for optimism are there here that these technical talks are going to continue as we look at the end of that 60-day period, not too far off?
Well, David, one of the reasons that the events of the last 12 hours or so have been so head-spinning is that there was at least a brief moment yesterday where it seemed like diplomacy had a chance, at least, to win the day. We did see those high-level talks between mediating powers and an Iranian delegation of negotiators. The U.S. was not directly involved, but they were closely monitoring the play-by-play from afar. And sources say that during that high-level meeting, the Omanis laid out a plan to fully open both lanes of the Strait of Hormuz, and that Iranians indicated that maybe this was something that could work for them. But they said they had to go back to their country first to talk to the highest levels of leadership and see if they could get buy-in. Well, it wasn't long after that delegation landed back in Iran that we did see the IRGC Navy come out and say that it was fully closing the strait and that it had hit that commercial vessel in the waterway, hitting another commercial ship yet again. So that was a very clear answer and very far away from what the Trump administration was hoping to accomplish. But we have seen through the conflict that U.S. officials have said that there are these more moderate factions within the Iranian government now that are willing to listen, that they can negotiate with. But what the events overnight prove is that so long as that there are these hardliners within the Iranian government, and so long as those hardliners are willing and able to pull the trigger on military action, on maximalist stances, that those are going to be the voices that are much louder at the end of the day.
Yeah, and there was some reporting from our colleagues at CBS yesterday that Iran had possibly said we shouldn't have done those strikes. That was a bit of one of those factions you mentioned, kind of getting out over ahead of where we wanted to be operationally. Shannon, I want to follow up with you as well, because I'm wondering if we've heard any more about these U.S. installations throughout the region and if it's changed the force posture of any of the embassies. I know some of the embassies there have been on authorized departure, ordered departure for months now. Friends in the embassy in Israel have not been able to leave that embassy for months and months. I'm wondering if you've seen any of those alerts go out or warnings to citizens in the region. What is the status of diplomats, and what are the warnings for Americans who might be in harm's way?
That's a great question. And we have seen that the security posture at embassies, many on ordered or authorized departure, largely hasn't changed. The one difference at the embassy in Kuwait, that was the only one where operations were fully suspended during the hottest days of the conflict. That was recently reopened. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, he took a trip there, attended the flag raising himself. But there is no question that this in-person diplomacy has been degraded somewhat because the U.S. diplomats just can't have the same position that they did have before this conflict. That was one of the reasons that Secretary Rubio did travel to the region. He wanted to meet with Gulf allies. He wanted to assure them that their security was of the utmost importance to the Trump administration. Now, officials do say that that was a successful mission, but clearly these widespread strikes by Iran overnight, even though they are largely expected when we see incidents like this, it's clear that from the Gulf allies, Gulf partners, they're saying this really can't be the new normal. It's been bad enough, but if it continues unchecked, there are going to be some very real consequences for their economies.
Abir, I want to pick up on that and just go back to what you mentioned a moment ago, all of the places that have been hit overnight. So we're looking at an air base in Jordan, attacks on Qatar, Kuwait, communications array radar installation in Bahrain as well. Shannon mentioning a moment ago just sort of the way that these Gulf allies are watching all of this unfold. And I'm curious, sort of among them, is there much coalescing in terms of encouraging these talks to continue, stressing the importance there being some resolution to this? Again, we're kind of focused on this binary between the U.S. and Iran, yes, with the help of Pakistan and with other nations kind of trying to force those conversations to take place. Are we seeing a wider movement to kind of convey the seriousness of this and kind of push for some resolution here?
Yeah, David, look, Qatar is one of them, right? Qatar is one of, or has emerged as one of the key mediators over the past few weeks or so to try to bring a resolution to this. But even Qatar today was attacked. And again, we mentioned the 3 people injured in Qatar. And so it does seem like there is some kind of, lack of communication within Iran's own leadership. For example, we haven't seen at all Mujtaba Khamenei, who is the current supreme leader, but we've seen a post of him on X saying that Iran must seek revenge for the killing of his late father, whose funeral was taking place last week, where the suspended talks were happening because of that mass mourning. But when it comes to GCC nations, yes, behind the scenes, what we've reported on multiple times is that they're really pushing for an end to this war and a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, simply because for the time being, it is still the waterway where the majority of their crude exports go through. Now, again, we've reported that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, have been doubling down on other routes to try to get their shipments across. But realistically, that's going to take a year to 18 months to start working. And then for Qatar's LNG shipments, we reported when the MOU was signed that Qatar will start ramping up production of its LNG shipments. And then just last week, we reported that actually they're going to pause that because of the skirmishes that we're seeing across the Strait of Hormuz. But when it comes to officials from the GCC, we heard last week from Anwar Gargash. He is a senior advisor to the UAE's president, essentially calling Iran a rogue player, saying that the skirmishes that are happening in the Strait of Hormuz just prove that it doesn't want an end to the war. And just now we're hearing from Saudi officials saying that what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz and Iran's actions in the Strait of Hormuz also prove that it really doesn't want an end to the war. So the question here really is, what does Iran want, and how can we arrive at those concessions that they agreed on with the United States? It does feel, for the time being, that the nuclear component of that MOU, that 14 concession MOU, David, that we've reported on, it does feel like the nuclear component has taken a back seat. It does feel like the Strait of Hormuz is front and center, and those attacks that are happening there are everyone's concern at the time being.
Well, that's true. I mean, we've talked about how it's such an easier trigger for them to pull, and it has almost an instantaneous reaction from the world, whereas the nuclear threat is just, it's more amorphous, and it's not impacting your day-to-day prices, and not at the moment. Shannon, before we let you go, I do want to ask you about Senator Lindsey Graham, who we found out overnight has passed away. Because I know we've traveled together on State Department trips, and it's always so funny to me that Lindsey Graham is one of those people that world leaders have met almost as often as the U.S. president, right? He seems to always be everywhere and almost the de facto Secretary of State. Can you talk about the role Graham played internationally and kind of what his standing was in these countries, especially countries that are closely allied with the U.S. when it comes to military cooperation?
That's right. And many world leaders have met with him more times than they have the sitting president of the United States. You don't have to go back very far. In fact, it was just this last week that Senator Graham traveled to Ukraine. He made that long, arduous, sometimes dangerous journey to go to Kyiv and meet with President Zelensky, sat down with him face to face for his 10th wartime visit to Ukraine. He has, of course, been a major supporter of that country throughout its war with Russia, and has been pushing for harsher sanctions against Russia to try to bolster Ukraine. He said just before he died that finally a Trump administration agreement had been reached with a bipartisan group of senators to push forward his package of sanctions, and that they were looking forward to doing that in the coming weeks. And it's very likely that we'll see those sanctions, that new package, push forward in his honor, because that is something that he would want his legacy to reflect.
All right, Shannon Kingston joining us from ABC News, and our colleague Abir Abu Omar is joining us from Dubai. Thank you both so much.
Thank you both, yeah. Let's get to the headlines now with Lisa Mateo. Lisa?
You got it. And this news just coming, guys. Ukraine has launched another series of attacks on vessels and energy infrastructure in Russia. Now, in a telegram statement, Ukraine's general staff, they say they struck a refinery in Russia's Samara region, causing a fire, and struck a number of tankers in the Sea of Azov. Now, in other news, a scary moment for U.S. Representative Khanna after he was detained by settlers and the Israeli military in the occupied West Bank for about 90 minutes. The California Democrat, who is exploring a 2028 presidential run, said he was leaving a small Palestinian village when a car of men holding guns pulled up and blocked the narrow road. Khanna was eventually allowed to pass after calls to the U.S. Embassy and Israeli police. The Israeli Defense Forces denied detaining visitors in the incident. The flooding in Missouri has turned deadly. The body of a woman who went missing in Crawford County. She was found after her home was swept away from its foundation. Rescuers have helicoptered more than 200 people to safety at a summer camp. The National Weather Service says the severe weather impacted a wide area stretching from the Ozark Mountains in southern Missouri into much of the Ohio and Tennessee River valleys. Spanish military units helped evacuate residents of Los Gallardos and on buses as their hundreds of firefighters continue to battle one of Spain's deadliest wildfires. And the blazes, they began early last week, and they've killed at least 12 people. It comes as parts of Western Europe face their third heat wave in 6 weeks. And the death toll from the twin earthquakes that struck northern Venezuela more than 2 weeks ago, well, it continues to climb. During a news conference yesterday, authorities said they're carefully removing millions of tons of debris to avoid harming any survivors as the number of those killed rises above 4,300. And rescue efforts, they remain active at 2 sites with the help of international rescue teams. So a lot of folks pitching in there. David and Christina.
Absolutely. Lisa, thank you very much. We've been meaning to get somebody on from Venezuela. We should do that soon just because this is a story that, as Lisa's pointing out, just continues to develop and
there's a lot
more awful than I think we thought at the beginning.
It's really hard, and also their government is in such an uncertain status right now, and there's also a lot to unpack with U.S. and how there's some reporting in the Times this morning about how Marco Rubio is directly involved in managing some of the finances and other parts of the government. It's a really fascinating story. Hopefully we can get that out this week. We did have a lot of breaking news this week to cover.
Well, President Trump's message to NATO leaders last week was a familiar one. Pay your share. And that message may be resonating. Last year, non-American NATO countries spent about 2.3% of their combined GDP on defense. That is up from 1.4% a decade ago.
We spoke to Admiral Daryl Caudle. He's the Chief of Naval Operations about the state of the alliance. He's America's highest-ranking naval officer, and he says he's not worried. Is NATO where it needs to be at this time for you to be able to have those conversations and make that a reality? Are you concerned about the viability of that alliance?
I'm not concerned with it. I just had them all here for INR. Just had a Five Eyes luncheon. Then I had a broad group with a lot of other NATO partners. They're committed. They understand it. There's sometimes a political level and a mill-to-mill level, but the Navy-to-Navy is rock solid. We understand exactly what we need to do to work well together as an alliance, and I don't have any concern with that. This idea of shifting more responsibility to them, I think they welcome it. I think it's needed. It gives me more options with my Navy to do things where only things that I can do, Christina. There's only certain things that the United States Navy can do, because of our capability mismatch, even over our alliances. And I need to be able to have the options and the degrees of freedom to apply my force to the problem sets. If I'm spending a lot of time doing things that other nations could actually quite do just as well as me, then that's the way we grow together to accomplish the things we need to do as allies and partners.
Let me ask you about one of those capabilities, because in 2006, the Navy decommissioned a bunch of aging Avenger-class minesweepers and kind of shifted a lot of that capacity over to NATO, which sounds like it works until NATO doesn't want to get involved in a conflict, which is what we saw in Iran. So how are you addressing that? How do you compensate for that lack of capability?
Well, one of the most challenging things you can do, and this is why it's so effective, is counter mine warfare. You actually, doing mine warfare and getting rid of mines in a contested environment, it's hard to do. Because
why is it so hard? It does seem like it's, from a layperson's perspective, it does seem like it's harder than I would assume.
Yeah, well, even in the Strait of Hormuz, which, in some places maybe like 7 miles across, 7 miles of ocean, and you put these things on the bottom, tethered to the bottom, without some exquisite intelligence, you're not sure exactly where they are. Trying to find that's a bit of a needle in a haystack, even for our capabilities. And so, we have some exquisite autonomous kit that goes and does that. These traditional Avenger class had a way to do that. We've had some helicopter, capabilities that do that through pulling, some detection system through the water. And then, but we're really going more toward unmanned capability to find and neutralize mines. And so I think that's another piece that's going to have a huge knee in the curve as we evolve these unmanned capabilities. And I'll also be able to do that better in a contested environment, because I don't have to have a manned platform in the battle space, in the actual weapon engagement zone, while I am demining if I have unmanned undersea vehicles doing it. And so that's where we need to get to.
I want to ask you a really stupid question. How real is that threat? Because we've been covering this conflict, especially given that we're Bloomberg, day in, day out, shipping, tracking it. We hear over and over again about these mines. I can't think of a single incident of one going off, striking a ship. Is there any chance that they're not there?
There's no chance they're not there. Okay.
Do you have any kind of idea of the scope?
I do. And, some of that gets into some classified intelligence. So I won't go into how we know and the numbers, but I can tell you mines are there. I can tell you that most of that is really shaping operations for the Iranians. The goal there is to force shipping into their side of the actual Strait of Hormuz. Yeah. That's their goal. Because they have this vision that one day they'll charge to transit an international strait. As well as I do, that's a red line, not just for the United States, for any country. We do not pay to go through international straits. And so that's something they aspire, and that's a sticky point in the negotiation. But that's the idea of their mining effort there.
As we watch conflicts elsewhere, especially the war in Ukraine and the kind of asymmetric warfare they've been able to do with these cheap drones, is the Navy where it needs to be on autonomous weapons, on drone warfare, on doing exactly what you just said, smaller, cheaper ways to combat some of these threats without having to fire, a Patriot or a THAAD every time you need to take something out?
No, we're not. We're not where I want to be. We're in a place where we are growing quickly there. I get this question quite a bit. And for me, I have to think about not only the autonomy I can build, which I can spend money on that and go do that, but I have to have a sound deployment model. See, unlike launching autonomy from land like Ukraine's use case, I have to do that by carrying that across the ocean. So if I carry that across, a large Pacific Ocean, I've got to have the motherships, if you will, ready with that type of autonomy in it to actually utilize that effectively, because I'm not launching that from land. So this concept of how I deploy with that kit is something we're working very heavily on. So we're investing, and it's also we're a bit stovepipe currently by domain. So we're strong with...
What do you mean by that?
So we are very good with unmanned undersea vehicles. We've been doing, I'm a submarine officer, been doing that forever, okay? We're really good at unmanned aerial vehicles. We've been flying drones around forever. And we're now coming into our own on what we call medium unmanned surface vehicles that can carry containerized payloads. It could be missile systems. It could be, sonar systems. It could be deception capabilities, all these things. We're probably more behind there. And these are ships that are about 120 feet long. They're completely autonomous. We're going to deploy with one of those with the Theodore Roosevelt Strike Group here soon. And
is this the first one?
The first one that's going with a complete unmanned surface vehicle. But more importantly, it's how we package unmanned to actually go complete a full mission is what I'm trying to do. So we're not just in our respective domains, but we package this like we do in the Joint Force to solve a real mission problem.
What is the biggest national security threat for America?
Well, that's it varies based on how I kind of answer that question. But, one of the reasons we have a strong sea-based nuclear deterrent is, of course, strategic, threats from Russia or China or anyone else who has a nuclear weapon. We have a machine here in the United States that relies on continuity of government, continuity of operations, continuity of decision making. That falls apart if you're under strategic attack. And so the way only way you can really prevent that currently is through a strong deterrent force. And that's why, our USS District of Columbia replacement submarine for Ohio is so vital that we keep that on time and on track. So that's, from a physical destruction and damage to our way of life here, of course. But, but cyber is, we've seen things done in cyberspace that are significant. Space is a place that I'm more and more concerned with. And then as a Navy, I'm always concerned at anything that stops the flow of commerce, anything that's in the sea lanes of communication.
You consider that a threat as well?
Undersea cables, right? 90% of our commerce still goes by sea. That's where the big super tankers are, carrying everything from Amazon we talked about earlier. And places like that, we have to keep those open, the choke points free, all these sea lanes open, and make sure our undersea infrastructure is protected.
I was reading a report by the U.S. Naval Institute that said Russia's presence in the Arctic was once superior, but its dulled military edge, partially due to the conflict in Ukraine, is giving the U.S. and its NATO allies an opportunity to reframe Arctic strategy. That's going to require a lot of cooperation from NATO. But is that something that the U.S. needs to focus more on?
Yes, we have, I call it an Arctic blindness. It's kind of out of sight, out of mind. Nobody understands it. You're talking trillions of dollars of rare earth, natural gas, and oil in that region. And people are going to try to, lay claim to that. Russia wants us to basically stay out of that area. This northern sea route, which is opening more and more, each year it gets a little more open. They want to control that, just like what we talked about. I could see them actually wanting to charge transiting that. It basically runs along their border side of the Arctic, but it's international, so that's never going to happen again. But it does take partnerships, Christina. I look at it kind of three ways if I could.
Yeah.
Number one, it's about presence. You have to be in the battle space because the environmental conditions there are tough. And so when you're above the Arctic Circle in the Arctic region, communication systems, temperature, weather, marginal ice zone, ice kills, all that, you got to know how to operate in that. Number two, that takes capabilities that the United States has. And we, need to work as a team of people in the Arctic Council, which are all NATO nations now, with the exception of Russia. Extremely important. And that is the last part, is the partnerships there. We cannot be there all the time. So we need better data fusion, more integration, more domain awareness of what's going on there. And then at our timing and tempo, we decide to deploy our forces to actually help out. That's kind of the ideal state. I did just hold an event yesterday with a bunch of countries on this very topic. I think we're all on like-minded of what we need to do there. But going forward, the Arctic is going to only grow in importance.
Before I let you go, approximately 20% of the Navy is women. About the same for commissioned officers. About 40% of the Navy is comprised of members of ethnic or racial minority groups. Do you think women and naval officers of color have the same opportunity for advancement in the Navy as they did even 5-10 years ago?
Absolutely. There is no question they do. They just, there's the strongest in my career structure for meritocracy there's ever been. I serve with so many incredible females. I serve with so many incredible minorities. And I think it's a great time to join the Navy, and there could not be more opportunity for all people who want to serve.
You don't have any concerns about when they look at some of these higher ranking individuals who've had their commissions removed or been knocked down and replaced with other individuals in the last year or so, about what that's going to mean to women and people of color as they think, well, maybe I can have a career in the Navy?
I do not. I think those that really look and understand, what they need to do to succeed in our armed forces are rising to the occasion every single day, and I could not be more proud of them.
All right, next 250 years, where do you see the U.S. Navy? Do you think we're going to be around, and what do you think the Navy is going to be doing?
The Navy will only grow in importance over the next 250 years. We are never going to be away from the oceans. Most of the people live near the ocean. All of our commerce goes via the ocean. There's never going to be any magic beans that's going to change that in a long, long time. And so the Navy's got a long history here. Now, I can't predict what the technologies that'll be in place that'll be kind of helping us with the character of warfare, but the nature of warfare really never changes. And I don't think the next 250 years will be any different.
Admiral, thank you so much. As an Army brat, I think I'm legally required to say, go Army, beat Navy, but it's still really nice to have you here.
You know that I'm required to say, go Navy, beat Army.
Thank you, sir. Have a great day.
You're welcome. Thank
Appreciate
you, Christina.
Admiral Daryl Caudle there with Christina. Ahead, Bloomberg's investigation into a shopping app started by Bill Gates' daughter with some big backers and why it may not be living up to its claims. Eager to talk about this in just a moment here.
It's
a fascinating story, and I should say, there's a tremendous interview that you just did. The way that they talk about these autonomous vehicles they're building, it's incredible, sort of the way that this is all changing.
And, I appreciated his honesty at parts where he thought they were deficient or things that were not going well. And he seemed very bullish on this. We're deploying our first one shortly, he said, and we have requested to go see it. That's right. Come on, guys, let us go see the autonomous Navy ship. But yeah, this is a place where they think that they can really make up for the fact that they have a huge remit right now. They're in so many different theaters and they're running out of personnel. We were talking yesterday about the USS Abraham, which is on this record-long deployment, and the last time they made port was in December, and the Admiral said it's a strain on operations and it's a strain on those folks. So I think they want to try to take that burden off while still being able to meet what the president and the country is asking them to do.
Really struck by the exchange you had with him at the end there, just about opportunity for women and minorities in the armed services broadly. This is kind of an issue of concern to a lot of folks who just look at the Joint Chiefs, how that changed so much.
And his predecessor was a woman.
Exactly. Yeah. And now I think all white men in the Joint Chiefs. So under a lot of scrutiny and a lot of people wondering, as you rightly point out in your question, whether that path to leadership within the armed services is the same as it once was.
I think that will have to be seen, but I appreciate his words on women leaders and minority leaders in the military, and clearly wants them to have a career in his branch of the military.
Yeah, and picking up on what he said in the part that we played yesterday from your conversation, still quite bullish on the Navy's ability to recruit and retain members of the
Yeah,
Navy.
he said the numbers are good. I also thought it was very telling that he pointed out that this is something that this administration tracks very closely. So they know the president wants to see those recruitment numbers up. And, you know, I remember when we were kids, they had the Marine commercials that were great, and they're trying to get Navy commercials that are just as exciting.
All right, going back to what I mentioned a minute ago here, FIA, you're going to have to walk me through this. This is a site.
You're not doing that much online shopping? I don't believe that.
But a major investigation by our colleagues here at Bloomberg on the way that the site FIA operates is coming up next. We're going to dig into that here on Bloomberg This Weekend on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's update you on today's top stories. South Carolina senior senator and foreign policy hawk Lindsey Graham has died. His office saying it happened after a brief and sudden illness. Graham, who changed from a Donald Trump skeptic to one of the president's strongest allies, had recently returned from a trip to Ukraine to meet with President Volodymyr Zelensky. In a social media post, President Trump called Graham a true American patriot. Lindsey Graham was 71. In sports, big news for the Seattle Seahawks. A group led by tech billionaire Vinod Khosla has agreed to buy the NFL team. Now, in a deal that Sportico says is valued at about $9.6 billion. In a post on social media, Khosla says that he was excited to be part of a great franchise. And Linda Noskova, she has won her first Grand Slam trophy. Did I nail it? Yes. The 21-year-old recovered from a second set meltdown to actually overcome Karolina Muchova in the women's final and become the third Czech woman to win Wimbledon in just 4 years. Now today, Jannik Sinner and Alexander Zverev go head-to-head in the men's final. And the PGA Tour continues with the Genesis Scottish Open at the Renaissance Club. Going into the final day of play is a three-way tie at the top of the leaderboard between Min-Woo Lee, Robert McIntyre, and Matt Fitzpatrick at 12 under par. And in World Cup action, another two teams are on to the semifinals. England defeated Norway 2-1 in overtime at Miami Stadium. It was Norway's deepest run of the World Cup. And Argentina, they topped Switzerland at Kansas City Stadium 3-1. So now, yes, the stage is set with Argentina taking on England on Wednesday. And France, they're going to battle Spain on Tuesday. David and Christina.
You watch these? You watch these games?
I watched the Norway
I did
one.
Too.
And the other one was a little too late.
I got an update when it ended,
yes.
unexpectedly.
Yes.
But yeah, you watched them? No?
No.
Oh, man.
No. I know.
It was exciting.
Yeah, it was exciting.
I actually did mean to, and then it was a lovely day, and I got distracted.
It's that, the intention. The intention matters,
It was
Christina.
actually being social, so just let me have this one.
We'll applaud you for that. All right, Lisa, thank you very much.
Thanks, Lisa.
A shopping app co-founded by Bill and Melinda Gates' daughter, Phoebe, is accused of claiming sales that it didn't actually drive in violation of many digital platforms' policies.
An independent researcher who studies affiliate marketing and Capital One shopping both claim that FIA used a tactic known as, wait for it, cookie stuffing to attach its own affiliate code to sales, claim referrals through fake clicks. All right, to break this all down, Bloomberg News looked into it, and technology editor Olivia Solon joins us now. This is complicated to explain. I think I understand it, but I think you will explain it better. So please explain to us what cookie stuffing is and why it matters and why it's considered like fraud, essentially.
Well, buckle up for a little explainer of affiliate marketing first. At its most basic, this is where retailers will pay a small commission to either publishers or influencers who send someone to buy something on their website. So let's say you're on a review site like Wirecutter and you're looking for laptops, you decide to buy one, you click through from Wirecutter to Walmart, and the link that you use to land on Walmart's page will have a special code in it, which will result in a little web cookie, there's the cookie, being left on the person's browser that basically says this shopper came from Wirecutter. So when that person buys the laptop, Walmart pays a commission to Wirecutter. But the key thing is, to get the commission, the user has to have intentionally interacted with the affiliate, in this case, Wirecutter. So clicking through from Wirecutter to Walmart. Now, FIA, it is a startup. It has an app, which lets you browse for clothes. And it also has this browser extension, which is this little program that you add to your browser. And as you're looking on e-commerce sites, it's kind of offers you discount codes. And in theory, FIA should only get the commission if a shopper clicks on one of those discount codes or clicks through from the FIA app to buying something. That's all like very normal way of affiliate marketing working. But what we found was that if you had the FIA extension installed on your mobile browser, it would fire an automatic click in the background the moment you put something in your shopping cart on any of the sites it had partnered with, even if you didn't interact with FIA's app or extension. So to go back to the Wirecutter example, you'd click through from Wirecutter, put the laptop in your shopping cart, and Fear would automatically click in the background, open a new tab that the user wouldn't see because you're on your mobile browser and you just see the one you're on. And in doing so, set the Fear cookie, overriding the Wirecutter cookie. And that allows it to take the credit for the subsequent sale, which it's not supposed to do. So instead of Wirecutter getting the commission, Fear would. It would also do something similar if you'd just gone straight to a retailer's website with no referral from another website. So it was kind of getting a commission for a sale that would have happened anyway. And we tested this across more than 50 retailers' websites and found it was consistently happening over our testing period it was a little over a week long.
Olivia, Christina used the word fraud a moment ago. This has a whiff of fraud to it. It does seem like it's in violation of terms of service. But when you look at the potential illegality of this, what do we find here? Were they kind of circumventing rules, doing something kind of enterprising, perhaps, to be most charitable? So where does this fall on the spectrum of online fraud?
So I think, at its most basic, it's a sort of breach of contract. Fear has relationships with a bunch of different companies. Well, it's allegedly a breach of contract. Yes. No one's sued yet, but Fear has relationships with a bunch of companies where it agrees not to do this. And so in doing so, it kind of opens itself up to potential litigation. Nothing's happened yet. And Fear, we still don't know if it was intentional, if it was some bug. But there have been other cases like Honey, which was another browser extension that was accused of something similar. It was bought by PayPal for $4 billion, wow. And it's facing class action lawsuits alleging that it had taken commissions from other affiliates. There has been one quite high-profile criminal indictment for this kind of activity. That was back in 2014. It was affiliates that were taking quite a lot of commissions from eBay, and the DOJ went after two of those affiliates, and I think they pled guilty and had custodial sentences.
Now, you did go to FIA, and it admitted the issue, and a spokesperson said, "We were made aware that in recent release, our code base was causing misattributions from a subset of users. As soon as we were notified, our team worked overnight to identify, mitigate, and has since resolved the issue." Has the issue resolved, and does it sound like, you said it's unclear if this was accidental or deliberate. What does the data tell you?
So yeah, as I said, we don't know whether it was intentional or not. We do know that the day that we went to disclose our findings to FIA, and it was also the same day that another company, Capital One Shopping, had also emailed a bunch of its partners with its own research findings, the same kind of findings. That was the day that FIA sort of switched this thing off. What we do know is that the code that enabled this feature was introduced to the extension source code back in December. Source code is public. We were able to look at it. And there was a feature called Enable Coupon Auto Drop that can be switched on and off remotely by FIA. It only happens on the mobile browser, not on the desktop version of the extension. And that's generally harder for the user to notice when you're on a mobile browser because you can open a background tab without seeing it. But yeah, we don't know. It's possible it was a glitch. We don't know whether this has been happening all the way back from December. We only know that the tool was available to use should they have put it on in the background for whatever reason. Since December.
Olivia, we've got about a minute left, but let me just ask you about this company more broadly. So started by Bill Gates' daughter, 23 years old. Look, it has big backers.
Forbes 30 under 30.
One of them. Well, that can be a curse more than a blessing.
Undefeated list.
If we look at recent 30 under 30s. But look, big VCs are backing this company. A lot of celebrities are as well. Sydney Sweeney, Hailey Bieber, the whole lot. What does this just mean? What does this latest news mean for this company, which has faced some bad news before?
So we still don't have a full picture of what happened, but we do know that some of its business partners, its affiliate network partners, have suspended working with them while they carry out deeper investigations. And so that could potentially lead to them asking for money back. It could potentially, hasn't yet, lead to litigation. We don't know yet. But yeah, as I said, there have been other cases that set precedent for this, similar kinds of activity. But they may, come back from this and it'll be fine.
Olivia Solon, thank you very much for joining us from London. Olivia Solon with that investigation from Bloomberg News. into this company founded by Bill Gates'
Excellent
daughter.
reporting. That reporting was just blowing up online yesterday.
Yes.
And thanks to Olivia, because we kind of scrambled to make sure she could get on here and explain it to us, and she did.
And
Much better than I could have.
We'll see what happens here with this company, which again has a not a huge valuation, but a sizable one indeed. A lot of celebrity connections.
Valuation of a company I would like to own, but yes, it's significant enough, I would say, most definitely.
All right. Well, coming up here, Raul Castro's grandson talks about his plans for the future of Cuba. That's coming up next, and you can explore live streaming news and interviews, all our Bloomberg TV shows, documentaries, reporter analysis, and more. It's all in one place. You can check it out at Bloomberg.com/videos.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Christina Ruffini. That's David Gura. We're going to go back to a story we've been tracking, and that's Cuba. Prominent Cuban leaders, Raul Castro's grandson, Raul Guillermo Rodriguez Castro, also known as Raulito, or wait for it, the Crab, made his first ever comments to U.S. media outlets when he sat down with USA Today. In the interview, Raulito expressed his desire to negotiate with President Donald Trump as Cuba faces a cratered economy, a humanitarian crisis, and an oil blockade.
For more, Rodriguez Castro, joining us now is USA Today's executive editor of investigations and storytelling, the woman who conducted that interview, Ruiz-Goiriena. She was part of the team who traveled to Havana to sit down with Raulito. And great to have you with us. Let's ask first just about the role that he plays in Cuban government. He's not an official member of the government, but has all of these connections. What do we know of what he's been doing lately? So we've heard from Secretary of State Marco Rubio. There's been this U.S. outreach to Cuba. Is he playing an active role in the negotiations that are and have been taking place?
Much for having me. And yes, he absolutely has been playing a pivotal role. He has been not only was he the only one to meet with Secretary Rubio, he has been in the meeting with the CIA director. He has been in the meeting with Undersecretary Jeremy Lewin, even though, as you rightly say, he has no official title within government. He is the liaison. He is the person that his grandfather has chosen to work in lockstep with the Cuban president, Miguel Diaz-Canel.
Talk to us about his unofficial jobs, because you write that he advises investment opportunities, negotiations, policy decisions. He also controls the security of Cuba's leaders. That seems like a pretty good place to have some influence. Why is he so able to hold these unofficial positions? Is it just because of who he is?
Well, actually, the only official position he ever had was the fact that he was the director of the internal security apparatus that would oversee his grandfather's security and also at some point Fidel Castro's security. But it's all the other roles as an advisor, a strategic advisor to his grandfather. So he says that, he spent the majority of his upbringing, the majority of his life really in every single room with his grandfather. And he was being primed the entire time, so he understands how Gaesa, which is this opaque military-run company, it's how it supports the Cuban economy. He's on advising meetings. I mean, he was also pivotal to this deal, this oil deal that then blew up a couple of weeks ago, which would not have been possible without him, directly engaging the government in order to get it done.
I want to linger on some contrasts. You do such a wonderful job laying them out there. He's wearing Hermes shoes. He's wearing a Dolce & Gabbana T-shirt and a Rolex. He's got a Ferragamo bag. This at a time when, as you also point out in your reporting and we've talked about on the show, Cuba is in such dire straits. And I wonder if you could kind of talk about how he's been able to live as large as he has. You go with him to a cigar club. I mean, he's living a very different life than most Cubans are. And I wonder what that says about him and his engagement with the people of Cuba, but his engagement with the world as well.
I mean, Cuba is a very, very complicated place, and it's a place of a lot of contrast. So I actually want to push back a little bit and say that, yes, the majority of Cubans are not wearing Hermes sneakers and they're not wearing Dolce & Gabbana, but the majority of Cubans do aspire. So there's something visible, military fatigues, don't have the rep that, don't have the cred that they used to. And there's something about him walking around like this that does. Now there are two Cubas, right? And there are people that have money that are flowing from remittances, that have access to these restaurants, that have access to these clubs, and he very much embodies that. Mm-hmm. And then there are people, as we are seeing with this dire humanitarian situation, that can't even cook, cannot even bathe. The power goes out, and then there's also no water. So I think that it is exposing and revealing the cracks of what we're seeing.
What do you think his goals are? I mean, you talked to him. I wonder how you got the make of him. We've heard Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, speak openly about how they are hoping for regime change in Cuba. Is this someone who you think is trying to position himself to be a palatable option to the United States? Is he enough of a change, or is he too much part of this regime in the eyes of the U.S. officials?
Well, I think I'm gonna kind of state the reporting that obviously Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been very emphatic that he wants absolute regime change. And if that means that there's a Castro, that means that there can't be a Castro in power. At least that's what they have said thus far. I think what Rodriguez Castro is trying to say is that Cuba is, quote, already changing, by virtue of having passed these 170 reforms that would open up to like foreign investment. I think one of the things that we had never heard in 70 years is that they would be willing to pay American companies for the confiscation of land and property and assets that happened as a result of the revolution, which could be, which is huge. We've never seen any kind of concession like that. But Rodriguez Castro insists that these are all economic, right? That there has to be respect for the revolution and the legacy of the revolution. Now it's up to, to readers and to viewers to decide if, we're not talking about 1959. This is not the same revolution of 1959, but, whether what we're seeing in 2026 is enough of a change. But definitely it's not the same as we were seeing in 2010, and even in 2021.
Yeah. Romina, thank you very much. Thanks for the reporting as well. That's Romina Ruiz-Goiriena joining us. She wrote that piece for USA Today based on reporting she did, the interview that she did with Raul Castro's grandson. Appreciate the time. And fascinating, the crab, because he was born with 6 fingers.
I was going to say, I need a better nickname. I feel like neither of us have nicknames. We got to work on that. Maybe in our 8 a.m. hour, which is coming up soon.
We'll do it, yes. We're coming up on 8 o'clock here in New York City.
Next hour of Bloomberg This Weekend starts right now.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from New York with David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo. The latest headlines, key analysis, big interviews, and the stories that hit home on your days off.
Bloomberg This Weekend, I'm Christina Ruffini here with David Gura and Lisa Mateo. We have breaking news this morning. Senator Lindsey Graham is dead at 71 years old.
Yeah, the close Trump ally passed away Saturday from what his office says was a brief and sudden illness. I want to welcome all of you here as we continue to talk about the legacy of Lindsey Graham over the course of this morning, highlighting what I said at the top of the 7 o'clock hour, somebody who was a real advocate for interventionism around the world at a time when the Republican Party was kind of withdrawing from that. And that'll be a theme we'll kind of dig into here over the course of the next couple of hours.
American-style democracy around the world. We're going to go now with Lisa Mateo and the headlines. Lisa, what else you got?
You got it. And President Trump calling Lindsey Graham a true American patriot. The South Carolina senior senator from Foreign Policy Hawk, who was also once a Trump skeptic, he became one of the president's strongest allies. Now, Graham had recently returned from a trip to Ukraine to meet with President Volodymyr Zelensky. To the conflict in the Middle East, where the U.S. and Tehran continued to exchange a wave of attacks. U.S. forces struck Iran for a 3rd time in a week, prompting retaliatory attacks from Tehran, as it declared the Strait of Hormuz would be closed until further notice. The Islamic Republic responded with drone and missile assaults on at least 5 American allies across the Middle East. A U.S. Central Command said fresh strikes targeting Tehran's ability to attack commercial vessels. Well, that came after Iranian forces hit a Cyprus-flagged container ship. And Ukraine has launched another series of attacks on vessels and energy infrastructure in Russia. Now, in a telegram statement, Ukraine's general staff said that struck a refinery in Russia's Samara region, causing a fire, and struck a number of tankers in the Sea of Azov. Now, we're also learning that President Volodymyr Zelensky has removed Ukraine's prime minister in a cabinet reshuffle. We'll keep you posted on that. Meanwhile, 4 people were killed, 17 wounded in Ukraine's northeast Sumy region. Authorities say Russian aerial glide bombs, they hit a crowded area where civilians were present. The attack struck a public transport stop on one of the streets, damaging several buses and cars, as well as multiple story buildings around those impact sites. And a scary moment for U.S. Representative Khanna after he was detained by settlers and the Israeli military in the occupied West Bank for about 90 minutes. The California Democrat, who's exploring a 2028 presidential run, he said he was leaving a small Palestinian village when a car of men holding guns pulled up and blocked the narrow road. Khanna was eventually allowed to continue that journey after calls to the U.S. Embassy and Israeli police. Israeli Defense Forces, they denied any visitors that were in that incident. And the New York Times says federal prosecutors have issued subpoenas asking 5 of its journalists to reveal their sources for 2 stories about security concerns on the new Qatari-gifted presidential jet. Earlier this week, the Times reported that the new plane, it lacks some of those features that the older aircraft, including anti-missile capabilities. The publication plans to fight those subpoenas. David and Christina.
Some forceful statements from the Times. Again, they are going to fight those subpoenas, and certainly an attack there on press freedom. So we'll see what happens with all that. Lisa, thank you very much.
All right, as Lisa mentioned, Senator Graham was not only the senior senator from South Carolina, but also a close ally and confidant of President Trump, stopping for him at various campaign events nationwide and making regular appearances at the White House and Mar-a-Lago. Here he was just 2 days ago in Ukraine.
Got a little update for you here.
Yeah.
Just tell me when I can talk. But good visit with the president, right?
Yeah, I think that we had really a good meeting.
Joining us now to discuss is Bloomberg White House correspondent Catherine Lucy. Catherine, great to have you with us. And again, sobering news. Eric Wasson, our colleague, described this as shocking, saying Lindsey Graham was a jovial and active presence around the Capitol,
kind to
which he covers, kind to
yeah.
reporters, and certainly somebody who was omnipresent. I think he was going to have his 64th appearance on Meet the Press this morning. So somebody who was really kind of a public face of this administration's policies as well. Let me just start with your reaction to this and kind of the void that it leaves here. Yes, on Capitol Hill, but in the Republican Party and Donald Trump's Republican Party as well.
Yes, I think all of that's right. Lindsey Graham was a vocal advocate for Trump. He was a lively and enthusiastic presence, I think, on the Hill, on TV shows, obviously on the world stage. And he had become very close to President Trump. As you know, they weren't always that close. He was a critic of him when he first ran for president, but they became very close on issues like foreign policy, judicial issues. They were very aligned, and he was somebody who was doing advocacy for Trump policies, and I think Trump. I think Trump's sadness and regret today is real. I think there was a real relationship there, and it does leave a void for him.
It's also very interesting timing because we had this NATO summit in Ankara. We had this surprisingly jovial meeting between the president and President Zelensky. I think we have some sound of them joking and laughing in that meeting. I think we've got it. We do not. Anyway, you heard Zelensky, you heard the President Trump talk about, you heard President Trump talk about like, oh, maybe you could go to Moscow. And Zelensky said, oh, I don't know. There's a lot of Ukrainian drones there. They had a photo with the big thumbs up. This was such a sea change.
Well,
and
also,
I wonder,
it was notable. Yeah, it was notable given how tense that relationship was earlier on in this Trump term, just how cordial and at times, light that meeting seemed to be.
Well, I was wondering how influential Senator Graham, who has been a stalwart advocate of Ukraine, even when the president was not. Obviously, his close ally, John McCain, was also a huge supporter of Ukraine. There's a room in the U.S. Embassy there named for John McCain. If he was possibly working behind the scenes, and what has prompted this change from the president, what you're hearing from the White House about how he's feeling when it comes to the Ukraine versus Russia conflict.
Well, certainly, Lindsey Graham was a stalwart supporter of Ukraine. I mean, he was vocal about that. I mean, his foreign policy views are well known, and he was such a close ally of John McCain. And we know that Lindsey Graham had the president's ear; that they were in close touch. The U.S. positioning has evolved. Since the president took office. You've seen the president's rhetoric change some. During that meeting this week with Zelensky, the president was was cordial. I think spoke about trying to find resolution that worked for both sides. Had I think more empathy for Ukraine, and certainly there was just a warmer rapport between the two.
Kathy, let me ask you lastly, just to situate him in the Republican Party. So as I mentioned a few moments ago, he was somebody who was traveling the world, was advocating for more U.S. engagement in the world at a time when there were many Republicans who were not doing that, who were encouraging kind of a more inward look when it comes to policy. Was he an outlier? Was he somebody who was kind of persuasive in that regard? How did you see him as somebody who was shaping the Republican politics of the moment?
Certainly he was a foreign policy hawk, and was a favored interventionist policy, and wasn't in line with everyone in the party, and the party has moved, I think, in the past few decades. So he occupied that wing of the party, but clearly he had influence. He had influence with the president. He had a senior role on the Hill, and I think he was able to make his voice heard.
Catherine Lucy, our White House correspondent, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. I know you're having a busy morning there in Washington.
Great to see you on this Sunday. All right, joining us now is former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations, Kurt Volker. Ambassador Volker, great to have you with us, and I want to start with Lindsey Graham and just give you the opportunity to talk about the relationship that you had with him over the years. I know that the work you were doing with NATO, with Ukraine, these were issues that Senator Graham cared deeply about, and I'm wondering how you're processing the news of his death on this Sunday morning.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It's really shocking to hear. He was just so vibrant, such a big figure. I've known him really since the 90s when I worked 1 year as detail in Senator John McCain's office, and I had met him then. I traveled with him many times, including to the Munich Security Conference as part of the U.S. delegation there. And then on Ukraine, Senator Graham called me very early on after Russia's full-scale invasion, wanted to talk to me about what was happening, and then invited me to brief the Senate Republican Conference to talk about what was happening in Ukraine. So he really played a major and very direct role, and it's really shocking and saddening to hear the news of his passing.
I do want to ask you, given your background as former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, about this Ankara summit we just had. Everyone was given a gun by the president at the end, and yet no one shot each other. It seemed to have been pretty amicable. What is your take out of that summit? We use this word very sparingly on this show, but the vibe seemed pretty positive considering how worried folks were going into it. Do you think there was a bit of a sea change? Just give us your outlook.
Yeah, well, first off, I agree. I think it was a very positive summit. And very good for President Erdogan, who was hosting, but also very good for President Trump and for NATO. And we can just tick off all the things that happened or didn't happen. President Trump came out of the meeting and said we had a great deal of unity. I don't think he's ever talked about the word unity with respect to NATO before. We had a lot of NATO unity, a lot of love in that room, he said. We had statements about freedom of navigation and support for the United States on Iran, something that I think President Trump wanted to hear. We had that meeting with President Zelensky, also very positive. You had the president making an announcement that we're going to allow Ukraine to use Patriot missiles or to build Patriot missiles under a license in Ukraine. That's a very big step, very important, very good for Ukraine, very tough messaging for Putin in that respect. You had the decisions on continued increases in defense spending by European allies, something President Trump has been pushing for. Some of that is going into defense industry development in Europe, which they desperately need. So this, all around, this was a very positive meeting and a very strong message to Vladimir Putin.
What do you attribute that to? So for many NATO summits, the peculiarity of these summits is they happen every year and they're pretty short. But at most recent ones, the president has really hammered on this funding issue. He did that at this one, but it seems like perhaps he's moved on from that. I think also of what Congressman Michael McCall told us yesterday from Kyiv when we spoke to him on the program, that President Trump likes a winner. And the fact that kind of the way that this war is being waged in Ukraine, how it's changed, how Ukraine is kind of has the upper hand now, may have had President Trump come around to this. I'm curious how you see it, why you think the rhetoric, why the president's position seems to have changed as much as it has.
Right. Well, with respect to NATO, I would not say that President Trump has moved on from pushing allies on defense spending. He's going to do that every time somebody pushes his NATO button. He's going to say Europe has to do more. That's just a given. And I think he's happy because they are doing more. So he's getting what he wanted, but he's going to keep pushing them as well. So that's one part. The other is the war against Iran didn't come out, at least not yet, the way that President Trump wanted. And I think you only want a certain number of problems at a time. So I think he wants to stabilize the war against Iran, keep oil and gas prices down. You don't need a problem with NATO at the same time. So that's a part of it. And also, he didn't want to do anything to embarrass President Erdogan, who was hosting the summit. So for a number of reasons, this was going to be a good NATO summit. It turned out to be a very good one. Now, with respect to President Zelensky, I think that's part of it. He does respect a winner. Remember a year and a half ago when President Zelensky was in the Oval Office and President Trump said, "You don't have any cards." Well, that is not true. It wasn't true then, but it's certainly visibly not true now. President Zelensky has an advantage over Russia when it comes to drones, counter drones, electronic warfare, defense technology and innovation, logistics, many things that he is doing that Putin is not able to do. And by bringing the long-range strikes into Russia and hitting Russia's source of money, which is the oil and gas industry, and their ability to refine, to provide fuel, both for the Russian people but also for the military, this is having a real impact on the finances and the military of Russia. So it is changing the dynamic there. And I think President Zelensky himself also has learned a lot about how to deal with President Trump. In that meeting again a year and a half ago, it seemed like he was trying to argue and convince President Trump and J.D. Vance that he's right. That's not something that you want to do, and not something you certainly don't want to do on camera and disagree in public with President Trump. This time, it was clear that he was disciplined. He didn't want to talk too much in public. They were going to have their private meeting. He wanted it to be a positive tone. He joked a little bit. That's the right way to handle things.
And possibly due to some coaching by some NATO allies, including Mark Rutte, who got some flack from a reporter asking how he maintains his self-respect by this, appeasement policy. But to your point, it does seem to be working. I want to ask you about those cards that Ukraine now feels it has. There was a very interesting video this week of a multi-million-dollar Russian tank abandoned by its crew, hatches left open, and a $150 Ukrainian drone flying in and destroying it. When you look at the asymmetric cost of this warfare, I'm wondering how long that's sustainable for Russia. And the other part of this is, of course, the hits on the oil refineries and the gas lines in Moscow, because Russia has been able to insulate itself pretty well from the impact of those sanctions and being kicked off SWIFT, possibly better than people expected. Is this really where we're going to start to see an impact on the economy?
Yes, you're absolutely right. So those are the factors. And you put it the right way. It's how long can Russia do this? It is not sustainable. You can't lose more people on the battlefield than you can recruit. You can't spend more money than you have. At some point, this is going to, this is going to have to stop. What Ukraine is doing is trying to accelerate the timeline. I think we've got to get Russia to the point of decision where they say, okay, we have to stop this. Russia's not there. Putin is not there. Putin really wants to continue the war. He really wants to subjugate Ukraine to Russia. He's going to keep fighting. He probably wants to have another shot at the winter. Remember last winter they tried to shut off Ukraine's electricity. They probably want to do that again and see if they can bring Ukraine down. It's not going to work. I think Ukraine's in a stronger position this winter than last winter. But Putin may want to try that. The idea is shortening the timeline. And this is why measures, steps, decisions, such as letting Ukraine produce its own Patriot missiles, such as the European Union giving them a 90 billion euro loan for defense, those things are signals to Putin that the future is going to be worse, not better for Russia.
Ambassador, we have about a minute left. I just want to ask about the counsel you'd give the president on engagement with President Putin in the run-up to this summit. He had an 85-minute phone call with Vladimir Putin. Would you counsel more engagement, less, or how do you see this kind of ending, if in a diplomatic space?
Right. Well, President Trump talks to Vladimir Putin. That's a choice. He thinks it's important to have a channel of dialogue. I think he has begun to realize that Putin lies to him all the time. That Putin says one thing about the battlefield, it's not true. He says he wants peace, but then he goes and kills Ukrainian civilians. So he says he wants to negotiate, but then you try to create a negotiation and he won't meet with Zelensky and he won't give up anything. He just wants even more in the negotiation than he has on the ground. So I think President Trump has gotten very frustrated with Putin for really not playing it straight.
All right, Ambassador Kurt Volker, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight on this Sunday.
Great to have him kind of in compliment with Michael McCaul yesterday, the congressman from Texas, again, who we talked to from Kyiv. And I think the message that we're getting from both of these gentlemen is that the circumstances have really changed here, and the optimism that Michael McCaul talked about on the battlefield, there really is kind of a change of tone. You said vibes a moment ago. It does feel like the kind of tenor of this war has shifted here in recent months.
It does. I have seen some analysis warning caution. You know, Putin is entrenched in that office. There is no opposition in Russia, and if he goes away, power abhors the vacuum. That's not always a better thing, especially in a nation with nuclear weapons that you'd like to keep tabs on.
The congressman's caution yesterday, too, that you don't want him to be pushed into a corner where he does something even more than dramatic.
Exactly right. All right, this week, on a different subject, the largest U.S. banks are set to release their earnings. We've got two experts here coming up after the break to break it all down. That is straight ahead on Bloomberg this weekend.
Joining us live on Bloomberg this weekend, I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's update you on today's top stories. U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham has died from what he called, his office is calling a brief and sudden illness. Now, the South Carolina Republican, he was in Kyiv as recently as Friday before returning to Washington, where he was scheduled to appear on NBC's Meet the Press on Sunday morning. NBC reporting that emergency personnel responded to a call for cardiac arrest at Graham's Capitol Hill home on Saturday night. President Donald Trump posting on social media that Graham was, quote, one of the greatest people and senators I have ever known. Lindsey Graham was 71. New York City's Guggenheim Museum is among a number of Manhattan buildings that have tested positive for the bacteria that causes Legionnaire's disease. Now, the city health department said the popular art museum has cleaned and disinfected its cooling tower. More than 50 people have been sickened in the Upper East Side outbreak, but none have died. And a parasitic infection causing severe gastrointestinal issues continues to spread. According to NBC News' latest tally based on information from state health departments, as of July 10th, over 3,000 cases of cyclospora have been reported, with Michigan, New York, Ohio, and Illinois, North Carolina among the hardest hit. And the parasitic stomach bug is commonly linked to fresh fruit and vegetables, and health officials advise the public to wash all produce before eating it and also wash your hands after handling it. Some good tips there. David and Christina.
Say good morning to all our hypochondriacs in the audience.
Also, welcome to New York.
There.
Thanks, guys.
Lisa, thank you very much for that update. Appreciate it. Well, 5 of the largest U.S. banks are set to release earnings on Tuesday on a day so busy, even Mike Mayo, Wall Street's swollest bank analyst, is skipping the gym. Bank of America, J.P. Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, and Citi will all release their earnings within the same hour.
I feel like this is an inside joke to which I'm not ready
dig
yet.
But
all right. And lettered in the week for the more sedentary among us later in the week, Netflix is going to kick off tech earnings. The streaming platform is struggling with slowing growth and increasingly fragmented industry. Joining us now are Bloomberg Intelligence senior analyst for U.S. banks, Herman Chan, and the editor of Investopedia, Caleb Silver. All right.
Mike Mayo, known weightlifter, hobbyist.
So it's the fact that he's skipping the gym.
It's a big deal.
Indicates how big this is.
Herman is the second
Herman's
the second swollest on Wall Street.
I'll take that. Yes, please. Thank you very much.
This evolves so quickly.
I'm going to Barry's after this.
It's a family show, right?
Perfect. I'm going to take a nap. All right. But you go work out. Do we always get these all at once? And I was reading some analysis from Bloomberg, which I do now, read bank analysis, saying that it's expected to be good but not amazing. Why is that?
Right. So banks typically try to stagger their earnings, but for some reason, this earnings calendar, there's 5 in one day, and Bank of America and J.P. Morgan have competing earnings call times at the same time on Tuesday.
Helpful.
So yeah, it's great for us bank analysts trying to listen to 2 earnings calls at the same time. But we're expecting really strong results overall for the banking sector this quarter. The banks have really shrugged off some of these geoeconomic issues and the K-shaped economy that we continue to hear about. There's really strong earnings power, both on the trading side, the investment banking side, and on the lending side. Your typical bread and butter commercial lending is really strong. So about 20% year-over-year growth. So yeah, we're looking for really good results overall.
Okay, let me ask you just about the role that SpaceX is going to play in all of this. So for so many weeks, we were focused on SpaceX's debut on Wall Street. You know that Goldman and Morgan were kind of running that IPO, but I don't think that there was a major firm on Wall Street that wasn't involved somehow. Is that going to be manifest in these results as we see them?
Yeah, everyone has a piece of it, and that's just some of the activity that went on that's going to help their bottom lines. The M&A activity, just the trading activity, which has been pretty robust among institutions, that's going to be good for banks too. I think what we want to hear is how healthy is the consumer. Bank of America, Citi will give us a pretty good window on that, Wells as well, but also the net interest margins. We know where interest rates are. We know where they're probably going to be for the next few months. What does that mean for bank profitability? And overall, what is the health of businesses and borrowers?
Herman, what are some of the concerns folks have with these larger banks? I was reading this morning that investors want assurances they can kind of keep this momentum going in light of AI valuations, higher gas prices. And also, we had this big kerfuffle about private credit. Did that not turn? Are we not worried about that anymore? I spent so much time learning about private credit. Was that all for naught?
It's something that's still lingering on the sideline. So it's something that it's a big growth driver. I mentioned the commercial lending growth. The private credit side of things is driving a lot of that. That being said, banks gave really heavy assurances in the prior earnings season that they're very comfortable with their exposure to private credits. They've underwritten it very conservatively, and it would take a lot of decline in the overall market, and you would be more concerned about the overall economy rather than their private credit exposure. Okay. So we have that going on. The other risk that we're looking at is really on the deposit side, given the fact that there's expected so much robust lending, that deposit competition has really intensified, so their funding costs would presumably increase, given the fact that we're not really expecting any more interest rate cuts over the back half of this year. That really contrasts the expectation heading into 2026, where there was 2 rate cuts baked in. So there's an evolving interest rate backdrop that could affect banks' net interest margins going forward.
We want to get into Netflix, but before we do that, I have a question for each of you. I'd love for each of you to answer, and that is, we get to hear from these bank executives over a speakerphone on Tuesday and Wednesday, yes, with Morgan. But Caleb, what do you take away from that? I mean, what are you listening for when you hear these executives talk? Do you appreciate kind of their vantage, their perspective on geopolitics broadly? Do you want to hear more granular information about the banks? What do you want to hear from these executives on Tuesday?
Yeah, some CEOs are more candid than others. Jamie Dimon among them.
Notoriously candid.
And he will tell you exactly what he thinks and exactly how the bank sees things. I heard him at the Reagan Economic Forum a few weeks ago, super candid, but also saying America needs to be strong defensively. We also need to make sure we are taking care of our people. So he cares about both of those things. There's also rumblings about the succession plan at JP Morgan. I don't think we're going to hear anything about that this week. He's still got some time in the seat. So he's a little bit more candid. But again, we want to know how strong are their customers? How robust is the lending going to be, as Herman mentioned? But also, how strong is the U.S. economy, especially when it comes to consumers and their spending?
Herman, how about you? What are you listening for?
Yeah, so that's right. Jamie Dimon's always been sort of the spokesperson for the industry. We'd love to hear more about the evolving backdrop, given the fact that we still have geopolitical tensions, where the economy is going forward, and then the succession issue. Marianne Lake recently stepped away from the bank, and there's 2 new co-presidents. Really the eyes are on Troy Verbaugh, who is going to lead the consumer operations going forward. Is he viewed as the heir apparent in Jamie Dimon's minds? I'm sure a lot of analysts will probe that thought.
Just to interject quickly here, I mean, this is like the longest running parlor game on Wall Street right now. When is Jamie Dimon going to step down? Does this latest move give you any indication of how much closer we are to that point? I mean, he is often asked about this, Jamie Dimon, and he is very quick to demur and say how much he loves his job.
Right. I would assume that we'll have more of that same refrain, where he's going to say he's in it for the next foreseeable future. That being said, succession planning is something that the board and the bank takes very seriously, and I think the 2 co-presidents really speaks to that.
All right, Caleb, I do want to get to Netflix.
Yes,
it's usually the start of tech earnings seasons. How is Netflix doing? Because as a consumer, I feel like they're having a bit of an identity crisis, right? When I think of like really prestige streaming, I don't think of them. When I think of like the CSI audience that my parents watched, I don't really think of them either. I don't really know what their brand is, and I wonder if that's part of the problem, is they're struggling to maintain consumers, to stop churn, and to come out where investors want them to be.
Yeah, things have been anything but chill with Netflix and its investors. The
well done.
Stock is down 20% year to date, down 40% over the past year. Not magnificent complacent by any means anymore, but it is changing the way it runs its programming. It's got some challenges in that it's got competition, but it also has introduced that advertising platform. How much is that growing? They're expecting some $3 billion from that. That costs about, I think, $8 or $9 if you want the ad tier program. They're able to raise prices. They have that pricing elasticity. They're able to raise prices pretty much $1 every year and not much churn, probably the lowest among the streamers. And now they're introducing a lot of short form programming. They're no longer really just a streamer. They are a global media platform, and they're trying to compete with YouTube.
But do you feel like they have enough of a strategy, or do you feel like they're just throwing things at the wall at this point?
Well, over the last couple of weeks, we've learned more about that strategy. They've started short form programming. They started a bunch of deals with very popular podcasters. The Bill Simmons Ringer universe is in there as well. Hot Ones is there as well. They signed some chefs to do some short form content. So they want to make sure they are not losing viewers who want that shorter form snackable content, and they're still building their library. They have a big slate coming out, including Narnia coming out later this year and a bunch of other big ticket movies. So they're trying to be everything, spending a lot of money doing it.
I want to ask you about their strategy toward acquisitions. So it wasn't long ago they were making a go for Warner Brothers Discovery. Of course, that fell apart. We now see the spin-off of NBC Universal and Comcast. I mean, they didn't make a play for Roku. I mean, how do you see their interest in expanding the business through mergers and acquisitions, if at all? I mean, once that deal fell through, I think there was some relief among many shareholders. What did it say to you about their kind of longer-term trajectory?
Well, the good news is that Netflix executives give long video interviews every earnings report. So I listened to it again last night from the last quarter. They said it didn't work out, but they learned a lot about M&A and how disciplined they want to be and what matters to them when it comes to making big investments. They have a lot of cash on hand right now, and they need to do something beyond adding these creatives and adding this short-form programming. I wouldn't be surprised to see an acquisition in the second half of this year or early next year, because investors want to see really what's next beyond short YouTube clips and adding podcasting to the platform.
Herman, to bring it back where we started, when we get these earnings reports, we usually get a macro look. When you go through them, when we get big bank day and none of us are working out and we're all on these calls, and by we, I definitely mean you guys, what are you going to be looking for? Anything specific that we should be watching for that I can steal later in the weekend to make it sound like I'm smart?
Right. So a lot of it's going to be what they say about the economy, right? Heading into this quarter, there's a lot of enthusiasm into the earnings, but one of the pieces of that enthusiasm is that the credit quality performance of the banks will be very stable. How that really shapes up going forward, a lot of the analysts will probe about that, given the fact that there is still a lot of risk. Energy prices are still high. You've had companies talk about consumers pulling back in certain areas of discretionary spending because of the high energy prices. How does that flow through into the banks in terms of customers and consumers paying back their credit cards and their mortgage? So we'll be looking forward to that.
Last question to you, Herman, picking up on what Caleb was saying a moment ago. We were talking about prospect for mergers and acquisitions. We've had the SpaceX IPO. SK Hynix had its listing on NASDAQ on Friday. Both of those are seen as kind of litmuses for how the market would be for offerings.
Right.
What's your sense of the verdict on that? I mean, there are a lot of companies here waiting in the pipeline.
Yeah, I think that's one of the areas of enthusiasm for the banks in particular, where banks are playing the AI and infrastructure side of things through their equity offerings, through their capital markets businesses, in debt underwriting, in bonds, in securitizations, CMBS. So these data center financing that needs to happen, and the capex that needs to be spent to build out the data centers. The banks are playing that by helping these companies with raising money. So the AI theme is a big part of the capital market story, and we'd expect more commentary on that in the second quarter as well.
Before we thank you, we need to get a shot of Caleb's socks.
I was going to do the same thing, actually.
For our radio listeners, Caleb wearing socks
These are
with Bloomberg terminals
socks
on them, accompanying his Vans, which is a classy, very stylish combination.
You can't get these socks.
No, Gura has great sneakers too. I'm always telling him to wear sneakers on the show.
Well, I'm going to covet these socks from here on out and find in which closet they're hidden here and pull them out.
We don't want you to feel left out because you guys are both great. Herman Chen, he's our senior analyst for U.S. banks, and Caleb Silver from Investopedia. Thank you guys so much.
All right, with the Strait of Hormuz closed yet again, what does it mean for key commodities that traverse that waterway? Senior commodity strategist Mike McGlone is going to be here next to talk about it. That's coming up on Bloomberg This Weekend, on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg.com, of course, available on the Bloomberg Business app. Stay with us.
Thank you for joining us on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's update you on today's top stories. And multiple people were injured in a chaotic fifth day of Spain's Bull Run Festival in Pamplona. Now, 6 bulls and accompanying steers, they charged through crowds who packed the narrow street course. One runner was gored in the face and a dozen more were injured during that 2.5-minute run from the pen to the bull ring. Not on my bucket list. To Wimbledon, where Linda Naskolova, she has won her first Grand Slam trophy. The 21-year-old, she recovered from a second-set meltdown to overcome Karolina Muchova in the women's final and become the 3rd Czech woman to win Wimbledon in just 4 years. Today, we have Jannik Sinner and Alexander Zverev, I can never say that, going to head-to-head in the men's final. The PGA Tour continues with the Genesis Scottish Open at the Renaissance Club. Going into the final day of play is a 3-way tie at the top of the leaderboard between Miwoo Lee, Robert McIntyre, and Matt Fitzpatrick at 12 under par. In World Cup action, another 2 teams on to the semifinals. Argentina, they topped Switzerland at Kansas City Stadium. That score 3-1. And England, they defeated Norway 2-1. It was overtime at Miami Stadium. It was Norway's actually deepest World Cup run. But before that match, fans of Norway's Erling Haaland, well, they had some fun with a lookalike contest in downtown Miami. Yes, a 6'5" Norwegian. He is known for his long blonde locks. He has become a World Cup favorite. About 24 people. Look at them there having fun. The winner getting 2 tickets to the game. Unfortunately, they didn't win, but hey, they were able to see him there live.
That guy just like eating a chunk of meat and drinking milk out of a gallon jug.
And he was actually from Norway.
Of course, the winner.
So
I was reading that Norway's approach to their soccer team is very different than like how we do it here. They do fun first, right? They want you to play different sports. They want you to enjoy it. And so the fact they got this far with that system is enough of a win for them.
They don't keep score, I think, till the teenage years. So
really? I didn't realize that.
It's very
I didn't know that either.
Montessori.
So un-American in the best way, but yes. Thanks, Lisa.
Lisa, thank you very much. U.S. officials say the Strait of Hormuz is open to all vessels seeking safe transit. That is despite Iran saying that waterway is now closed.
Here to discuss what that means for key goods and commodities as they try to get through that strait is Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Commodities Strategist Mike McGlone. All right, Mike, one country says the strait is open, one country says the strait is closed. What are the markets saying?
Well, the market is kind of believing the U.S. and kind of pushing back in the rhetoric from Iran. And even if it does, they do close it up significantly. And we've proved that what the sentiment was is 20% of global supply turned out to be 10% or less because of invention and necessity. People found ways around through pipelines. The key theme for me is what will it take to get crude oil to stay above $80 a barrel? $80 a barrel was significant because it was last year's high versus its normal propensity to head towards its cost of production, the world's largest producer, which is around $55 a barrel in the U.S. So I think it's more likely to head lower. But the key thing that's happening in crude oil is we have a significant bifurcation between the actual price of crude oil, which I think is going to head lower, and the price of gasoline and diesel, what we call distillates at the pump. And that word we use for that is the crack spread, the spread between what actually is refined from crude and what the underlying foundation of crude is. And the crack spreads have reached the highest almost ever, but very similar to what we got in 2022, which marked a peak in price, and then everything rolled over back lower.
Christina, who doesn't like the crack spread right now is one President Donald Trump. He's still furious about the price of gas relative to the price of oil. A very basic question for you here, Mike. Look, oil is so much less than it was at its wartime peak, and I'm curious why that's the case. It seems to me that the level of confusion and uncertainty may have subsided a little bit here, but as we pointed out, there are dueling narratives about the state of the strait. There's still a lot of uncertainty about the path forward for this war. Why then are oil prices still as low as they are relative to where they were at the start of this conflict?
Well, David, I really enjoyed pointing out some of the things I did in 2022 and the foundation of this country and Adam Smith and the high price cure and the invisible hand. And that's what we really accelerated is the price-making status in crude oil shifted to the Western Hemisphere, with U.S. in the middle. We used to be the largest importer. Now we're one of the largest exporters. That's what shifted. And if you include Canada, we're approaching a surplus of crude oil liquid fuel supply next year of 8 million barrels a day. And a lot of that, what happened is we just accelerated that process of more supply coming from the Western Hemisphere, from Canada down Argentina. and OPEC becoming more and more redundant. So it accelerated that process. Also, and I always look over at the latest estimates from the Department of Energy for U.S. gasoline demand. It's declining. Yet prices have spiked. So this is a classic cycle in commodities. Typically what happens in crude oil, let's just look at it, it's been in a 20-year range. We're right at the bell curve of that range, right around $71 a barrel. We just pumped up the upper end. We accelerated more supply, decreased demand. We're probably going to head towards the lower end. So by the end of the year, I'm making a call that crude oil is going to be below 50, maybe even 40. And one key thing for that is almost always bottoms when the stock market goes down a little bit. We usually get a pickup in stock market volatility for midterm election years. And it's, so that to me is a key thing to look forward to the second half of the year. And the bottom line is, what does the leader of the largest energy producer, net exporter, and someone who initiated this war in Iran need for the midterms? He needs lower energy prices. I fully expect that to happen.
I've written this down, Christina. McGlone's call, 40 to 50.
It is. He wrote it in blue highlighter, so you know it's real. I do want to ask what the role of reserves is playing in this pricing, because I've seen some very complicated charts. There seems to be a bit of a debate about how much that has been keeping the price more palatable despite these disruptions. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve is at a 20-year low, and then demand from China has really dropped off, and the thinking is that they are also drawing on reserves. What is the status of those reserves? Do you expect that to continue throughout the end of the year, or do you think this will be replaced at some point with just taking supply from where it comes?
Well, I'm glad you went there because reserves are significant. Remember, the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve was started in 1974 by President Ford to cover 90 days of net imports. I just pointed out we have a surplus of exports. So we don't really need it anymore except for things like hurricanes and what just happened. And the key theme of a country who really needs reserves is China. What we found out, what didn't really make a lot of sense last year, is why crude oil, their demand stayed steady around 11 million barrels a day, yet their 10-year notes yields were collapsing, showing an economy that's really in deflation. Is we found out that China built up some of the best reserves and biggest in history, and they need to. They're a net importer. The lessons I've learned in commodities is Chinese are the best traders. Prices are up, they sell. Prices go down, they buy. And I fully expect that cycle to go lower. But the thing that we learned is China has a pretty significant surplus of reserves. And by the way, EVs in China are cheap, and it's over 60% of sales now.
There you go. Mike McGlone, Senior Commodity Strategist at Bloomberg Intelligence. Mike, always great to talk to you. Thanks for the time on this Sunday.
Mike. All right, the Iran war has had a number of ripple effects, oil just being one of them. An unexpected concern, Japan's love for plastic.
Japan loves plastic. The viral egg sandwich, onigiri, sushi, even single servings of fresh fruit. All of these things come swaddled in layers of plastic. But the Iran war has forced Japan to rethink its affinity for the material. Disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz have derailed supplies of naphtha, a key oil feedstock used in making packaging items like plastic. That's caused price hikes and shortages, forcing retailers to look for alternative materials. Convenience store giants Lawson and Family Mart have introduced measures like biomass shopping bags and paper coffee cup lids to address the crisis. Some grocers have scrapped packaging altogether. Environmentalists are hoping that the naphtha shock will be a wake-up call for Japan. Regardless of the war, the country could be facing a plastic shortage by 2030 if it doesn't curb usage and get a handle on recycling. But reversing Japan's penchant for single-use plastic will be no small task. The habit is rooted in the country's obsession with convenience and food hygiene. Plus, plastic's relatively cheap. Japan produced 63 kilograms of plastic waste per person in 2023 and ranked second in the world for plastic packaging waste per capita, just behind the US. So far, government initiatives to curb plastic use, like charging for shopping bags, have yielded some success. But many think the government could do more to incentivize behavioral shifts, like subsidies or providing more support for sustainable materials instead.
This is really hard because I know it's very cultural. It's a lot of, concerns about germs and cleanliness, and they have a lot of everything is packaged over there. Mm-hmm. I don't know about you, but before COVID, I was really trying to cut down on my plastics. When I bought produce and stuff, I would just throw them in the basket. And then all of a sudden, we were worried about germs and contaminants.
Individual pieces of fruit.
Exactly right.
Wrapped as well.
I try very hard. It's very hard to get away from single-use plastic.
That is true. But no, this is a huge, as was pointed out in that piece, as we talked about with Mike McGlone, yes, we talk a lot about oil, but there were all of these kind of petro products associated with it affected by this war.
Exactly right.
In Iran as well.
All right, and ahead, could AI help the problems of an aging global population? We'll talk about it next. And no matter where you're going, whether you're aging or not today, take us with you.
We're all aging.
We're all aging.
We're all doing that. But
we're on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg TV. Stream us live on the Bloomberg Business app. We will be right back. It's Bloomberg This Weekend. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Christina Ruffini alongside David Gura. Countries around the world are facing a major demographic shift. People are living longer, birth rates are falling, and governments are trying to find ways to support aging populations with fewer workers.
Could artificial intelligence help fill that gap, or is the technology being asked to do too much, too soon? Joining us now, the executive director, co-founder of the Budget Lab at Yale University, one Martha Gimbel. Martha, great to speak with you once again. As you point out in this piece, in this forecast piece for Bloomberg Weekend, the hope here, artificial intelligence could help America innovate its way out of the demographic decline. Are you optimistic that's going to happen?
Not really.
Okay.
Thanks for coming on. That'll end our segment.
It's always great to see you all. I think you're sometimes seeing this, tendency from people to say, particularly in tech, like, oh, well, the population is aging. That's an economic problem. But AI is coming. It's going to ride to the rescue. It's going to save us all. And I think one of the things that I think about a lot is that, one, we haven't seen technological transition during a period of demographic decline before. We've only seen it in the context of exploding population growth. And also, these transitions don't overlap with each other particularly well. And so really what you're doing is throwing one transition on top of another transition and just likely compounding and making more difficult the effects of each of them.
That's what I was going to ask. It seems like it could almost be a 1-2 punch if you've got AI coming in and taking jobs and aging, transitioning out of the labor market, what that does for disruptions in companies and how they cope with that.
Exactly. And, the jobs that AI is likely going to be helpful with, whether it's increasing productivity or replacing workers, doesn't line up particularly well with the jobs where we have a lot of older workers, or frankly, the jobs where we have a lot of immigrants, right? So, if you think about, for instance, flight attendants, they tend to be older, but that's also not a job where AI is likely going to make a huge difference. And so it's not like you can just slot the technology in.
Martha, the last time we had you on, we were talking about Victorian fiction. We know you as a student of, a lover of history, and something we hear an awful lot in the context of the AI revolution, this AI era, is look at the Industrial Revolution. What a great analog to this. And I'm curious how good an analog you see that as, and what that tells us perhaps of how this might unfold when it comes to U.S. demographics.
I think it's really useful to look at the Industrial Revolution, but I think it's also important to highlight the places where it's different. And demographics really is one of those. So, for instance, from 1750 to 1814, the population of England doubled, and then you threw technological change on top of that. We are not facing a doubling of the population, right? That is a difficult demographic change in its own way. It likely made the Industrial Revolution more difficult for people to live through. But it means that we can't look at it for an exact parallel.
Where can AI be useful? Because we talk about all the places where it's not useful. Do you see anywhere it could fill some of these gaps, solve some of these problems? Or is it just not at a place yet where when you look at demographic changes and people leaving the workforce, you find it particularly helpful?
Or do we not know? I guess that's the other part.
Fair.
Yeah. I mean, I think in so much in AI, people are looking for certainty. And per your point, we just don't know. I think also if you think about the consumer side of this, which I think is not talked about enough in the AI conversation, right? What do consumers want? Where is consumer demand going to increase? You're going to have more and more demand for healthcare and for, jobs that look after people as the population ages. And so then you have a question like, can AI help with that? And do people want AI to help with that? Or do they want to, age with humans around them and who are looking after them? And so I think we need to think a lot about what the consumer is looking for in the situation as well.
That's where I wanted to go. And you point this out in the piece, that when you look at what AI can do, the way that it's being talked about as kind of a panacea for certain parts of the economy, there isn't a kind of tidy Venn diagram when it comes to this aging population. Talk a bit more about that, the way that AI stands to change or revolutionize the economy vis-a-vis an aging population. There are things that an aging population needs and can do that perhaps AI isn't well equipped to or positioned to help with.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, for instance, Japan, they have had an aging population. They have experienced some amount of technological change while the population has been aging. And you have seen that they have moved towards more automation and some automation, right, that is aimed at helping them deal with their aging population. AI nurses who will call to check in on people and make sure that they're doing okay. But I think one of the things that's really important to think about is like, is that something that people want? I will say my mother has already called me and said, please do not put me in a robot nursing home. I want a human nursing home. Which, Mom, I promised. But, I think you have to think about, like, one, what can AI do? And also, what do we want AI to do? And what are the things that are really going to increase our living standards and make things easier for everyone? As opposed to where are the things where that, sort of human touch is really important. And we want to maintain that and figure out ways to foster that as well.
Got about 30 seconds left. Is there a place where you see that being useful for an aging population? I think about, we were talking earlier this week about new AI robots that can do laundry, that can do some of the caring things that can be expensive, and maybe we could bring down the cost on that and just focus at other places, focus it where it will actually work in the workplace.
I think robots are a really important part of this. Elder care is incredibly physically demanding. And if you can help, lift people out of bed, things like that, that's going to make a huge difference for the quality of care.
Martha, always good to talk to you. Appreciate it. That's Martha Gimbel at the Yale Budget Lab joining us on this Sunday morning. And I think such a fascinating thing to underscore here is that we just don't have a ton of data on this yet. And I think that's a big variable in all of this. Sort of what is AI going to do? A lot of promises, but very little data on sort of what it actually is doing in real time right now.
And she makes a good point in her piece where if you are in a job where it's physical and you are retiring at 65 or 70, that's probably you're not using a lot of technology yet. And it's not a job that yet these robots can do.
Robot nursing homes.
I'm a little glad that they can't do that job yet. Can't do our jobs yet.
No,
so we're going to stick around for the next hour. You're stuck with us. You can read more about this story and get a jump start on your week ahead with the Forecast newsletter. Subscribe at Bloomberg.com/newsletters.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from New York with David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo. The latest headlines, key analysis, big interviews, and the stories that hit home on your days off.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend. We're coming to you live from Bloomberg's world headquarters here in New York City. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We're here with Lisa Mateo. It is Sunday, July 12th, and one of our top stories we're covering today is the unexpected passing of a giant of the Senate, that is South Carolina Republican Lindsey Graham, dead at 71. It was a sudden and unexpected health incident, according to his office. Not quite sure what happened. He had just been in Ukraine. There's video of him looking quite healthy, meeting with President Zelensky. He was back in Washington for not very long, and then reports that he has passed away overnight.
His 10th visit to Kyiv, and we're going to dig into sort of the role that he played on the world stage here in just a moment. But first, let's get the headlines with Lisa Mateo. Lisa?
Yeah, and I'll take it from there, guys. So President Donald Trump calling Lindsey Graham a true American patriot. The South Carolina senator and foreign policy hawk, who was once a Trump skeptic, became one of the president's strongest allies. Graham had recently returned from a trip to Ukraine to meet with President Volodymyr Zelensky. And speaking of which, Ukraine's president is reshuffling his cabinet. Volodymyr Zelensky says he will remove the country's prime minister in a move to align Kyiv's government with new political strategy. Sources say he could tap a state energy executive or a former premier as a replacement. Now, in a social media post, Zelensky said he was grateful for her clear, steady, and effective work, and also warned about upcoming changes among heads of law enforcement agencies. Meanwhile, Ukraine has launched another series of attacks on vessels and energy infrastructure in Russia. In a telegram statement, Ukraine's general staff says it struck a refinery in Russia's Samara region and a number of tankers in the Sea of Azov. And the attacks come after 4 people were killed, 17 wounded in Ukraine's northeast Sumy region. Authorities say Russian aerial glide bombs, they hit a crowded area where civilians were present. The area struck a public transport stop on one of the streets, damaging several buses and cars and multi-story buildings. To the conflict in the Middle East, where the U.S. and Tehran continue to exchange a wave of attacks. U.S. forces struck Iran for a 3rd time in a week, prompting retaliatory attacks from Tehran as it declared the Strait of Hormuz would be closed until further notice. The Islamic Republic had responded with drone and missile assaults on at least 5 American allies across the Middle East. U.S. Central Command said fresh strikes targeting Tehran came after Iranian forces hit a Cyprus-flagged container ship. And the flooding in Missouri has turned deadly. The body of a woman who went missing in Crawford County was found after her home was swept away from its foundation. Rescuers have helicoptered more than 200 people to safety at summer camp. The National Weather Service says the severe weather impacted a wide area stretching from the Ozark Mountains in southern Missouri to much of the Ohio and Tennessee River valleys. And Spanish military units, they helped evacuate residents of Los Gallardos on buses as hundreds of firefighters continue to battle to contain Spain's deadliest wildfires. The blazes, they began early last week and have killed at least 12 people. It comes as parts of Western Europe face their third heat wave in 6 weeks. David and Christina.
Lisa, thank you very much.
Thanks, Lisa.
Appreciate that update. Well, world leaders are expressing their condolences over the death of Senator Lindsey Graham. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu calling the senator one of Israel's greatest friends.
And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky posting to social media that Graham was a true defender of freedom. Joining us now are Bloomberg America's Weekend's managing editor Kevin Whitelaw, Bloomberg Middle East reporter Dan Williams, and back with us is Bloomberg congressional reporter Eric Wasson. Eric, I want to start with you. We spoke to you earlier this morning. This was very unexpected, and I'm just wondering, as this shock kind of ripples through Washington as people wake up, what you're hearing from his colleagues and just people around the city in all branches of government, both parties, because he was just such a monumental figure and had been there for so long.
It certainly is very shocking. I think we're hearing from President Trump on NBC right now saying he talked to Graham last night, just hours before the senator passed away, and that he is in shock. So I think from the president on down, everyone is just reeling from this. He was a longtime member of the Senate, one of the most colorful personalities that we had out there, and really a pillar of the Republican foreign policy establishment. This is in some ways irreplaceable Republican ally of Ukraine, a staunch supporter of Israel, and staunch critic of Iran, one of the biggest boosters of the Iran war. And, I was talking with a colleague, probably the Iran war wouldn't have even happened without Graham's really urging it on the president. So I think this is going to leave a real change in the dynamic in the Republican Party. I'm also writing about in South Carolina. It's a solid red state, but, there's going to be a scramble now for that Senate seat. Joe Wilson, the senior Republican in the House delegation, may be in the pole position, but we're hearing, I haven't confirmed this yet, that Nancy Mace may be running. So it could become very hotly contested quickly.
Dan Williams, let me go to you. And on that tweet from the Israeli Prime Minister, the kind of friend that he had in Lindsey Graham, this is a senator who wandered a long ways from Greenville, South Carolina. He liked to be on the world stage. He liked to go to where the action was all over the world. And I'm curious sort of how you're thinking about the role that he played. No doubt a familiar face to you, somebody who traveled to Israel a number of times.
Absolutely. He's been treated in Israel almost as a member of the family whose loss has shocked pretty much every significant political leader. Wall-to-wall statements of mourning, statements of comfort to his family. I think not only what he represented, the loss of a fast friend in high places in Washington, perhaps there's a sense of elegy here because there is a concern he might have been one of a dying breed, of a generation that were very open, cordial, sincere, religiously motivated often in their support for Israel. Bipartisan support for Israel, which was once taken for granted, can no longer be taken for granted in Washington. And you even had a member of Netanyahu's security cabinet saying on the radio today that she hopes that senators can be found to replace him in terms of that intense and intimate and very real and open support for the country. So beyond that immediate loss, I think there's some concern as to what the future holds, especially the immediate future, given that the Iran war is far from concluded.
Kevin, on that note, I wonder what the loss of Graham you think means for the direction of policy, especially when it comes to the president, because you got the impression that Graham was at his heart more of a traditional Republican, believes in American power, believes in intervention overseas, but had this way of ingratiating himself to President Trump and maybe quietly trying to get in his ear about some of these things without normally going against him outwardly. Although when the MOU was struck, we did have a rare moment from Senator Graham where he tweeted, very skeptical of that deal and whether or not it was going to be durable. And I'm looking at our colleagues, and our White House colleagues are listening to the president on NBC right now saying very kind things about the senator and saying he got a message around 1 o'clock in the morning from his office that he had passed away. He was like a member of the family to me. It's very tough, actually. What does his loss mean for the direction of policy and the direction of this president?
Well, I think, if Israel's concerned, I think Ukraine has to be a place that's even more worried now about what the absence of Lindsey Graham is going to mean for the Trump foreign policy and the approach to that conflict in particular. I do think that Lindsey Graham, who had famously been a very, very strong critic of Trump when he first started running and early on in the 2015, sort of 2016 cycle, one of the reasons that Lindsey Graham became close to Trump, I think, was in part to make sure that he could have some influence on foreign policy. And it ended up being the Ukraine conflict, which was one of the main places where he really weighed in. I think sort of helped keep Trump in the camp of Ukraine, or at least not abandoning Ukraine, which I think had been some of President's initial instincts when he took office. So in terms of what it means for Ukraine, what it means for the broader NATO alliance, you certainly saw Lindsey Graham lay some groundwork for Trump to have some kind of rapprochement with NATO. I think those are all going to be real open questions as to whether there's really anybody left that Trump really listens to who's going to be the same kind of voice for those allies. So I do think this has the potential, maybe not immediately, but down the line to start to have a situation where Trump may well drift a little bit, unless there's someone else that emerges that can have that kind of voice for him.
Eric Wasson, let me return to that tweet that Christina mentioned just a moment ago, and I want to get your sense of what it illustrates. I think, as you know well, there's a caucus of Republicans who act more like a claque for this president than anything else. They rarely criticize him, and I think that's something that's lost here as well. The way in which Lindsey Graham could criticize the president on certain issues and seemingly not lose favor of the president. He would still talk to Lindsey Graham. He would still value the opinions of Lindsey Graham. We didn't see him behaving with the same level of trepidation I think we see from a lot of Republicans. And I wonder what that says to you just about the direction of this party, to lose that element, somebody who could push back on the president in the way in which he did.
Yes, I mean, he is obviously very, very close to the president, but kept to his hawkish views. And I think the president respected that. And the president being tossed between two different factions within his administration, those led by Vance, who want to try to avoid foreign intervention, and Graham, who seemed really comfortable with foreign intervention, even talking after the Iran war, launched of avenging the attack on the Marines in Lebanon in the early 80s. He just was very dyed in the wool, hardcore foreign policy hawk. That kind of voice, he's a senior appropriator, the person in charge of the State Department budget. It's just going to be a real loss for that wing of the party.
Dan, I also want to ask you, we were talking earlier in the hours about Graham's role as kind of a mini Secretary of State because he was so well-traveled and he was so committed to foreign policy. Our colleague from ABC was saying a lot of world leaders have probably met with Lindsey Graham more than they have the Secretary of State or even the president. What does it mean for foreign officials, for foreign presidents and leaders to have one of these giants of the Senate that they can go to in an alternative of the president when they need their policies to come across, but they've had conflicts with the White House, knowing that someone like Lindsey Graham, who's a known quantity, could be another option for them to try to get what they need out of their American allies?
I think it's very significant. I'd go a step further in the case of Israel, in the case of its Prime Minister Netanyahu, and this US President Trump. I'd even say that Graham at times served as kind of a Trump whisperer, someone who could step in to bridge gaps, maybe translate Israel's needs, Netanyahu's needs into Trumpian language, perhaps salve or say calm the waters when there was some sort of disagreement. I think the Israelis saw him as a safe harbor, someone they could really express their concerns to in the hope that those would be relayed safely, quietly, and discreetly to the US president. We might actually be seeing this played out, ironically, in different form, in funereal form, when the senator is laid to rest, because it would appear, according to Israeli media, that Netanyahu would plan to attend that, albeit at short notice, in the hope, besides showing his respects to someone very much valued in Israel, in the hope that during that trip he would also manage to meet Trump. As we know, for a couple of weeks now, Netanyahu has been speaking about an impending visit to the White House to meet Trump. That hasn't come through in terms of scheduling. This might be the opportunity for that. So it would appear that even in death, this Senator Graham, is still providing a bridge between those two leaders.
Eric Wasson, let's talk about the committees that he was a member of and where this leaves them. So he was chair of the Senate Budget Committee. He was on Judiciary and Appropriator as well on the Senate Appropriations Committee. Look, there are plenty of people who would say the Senate in its current form is broken, but he was still an old school institutionalist, and being on those committees, he was able to kind of propel them forward, try to get back to the way things once were. When you look at the relative brokenness of this U.S. Senate, the world's greatest deliberative body, where does it stand now, having this void, not having Lindsey Graham there to kind of guide it in the way in which he did?
There'll be a key test coming up just Friday. He and a group of senators, including Democrats, Shaheen and Blumenthal, announced a deal on an Russia sanctions bill, I should say, a bill that would empower the president to sanction countries like India and China that buy Russian oil. This is something that Graham has been pushing and trying to get the president on board with, and he said he had, in fact. And this is an instance of him, there's 85 senators who support this bill, sort of really pushing forward his agenda, his critic of Putin agenda, and we're trying to work with the president. So that's kind of a key linchpin to moving that one forward. But he's also on record, and for a long time he was trying to advocate for an immigration deal. He was part of a large coalition trying for a grand bargain on immigration. On the other hand, as chairman of the Budget Committee, he put aside any concerns about the deficit and rammed through a $4 trillion tax cut last year. At the behest of the president using funny math. So, he's been, some people would say a chameleon, but he's been very much someone who's very adjustable, very flexible. And as you pointed out, he was, as Kevin pointed out, was a very big critic of President Trump. I was at a Washington Gala where he absolutely ripped into the president, making fun of him, but then turning, and again on January 6th, also saying he was done with the president after that riot, but then turning again into a close confidant and friend of the president.
Kevin, I do want to ask you where we stand with the conflict in Iran. Obviously, this ceasefire that never really was a ceasefire, but seems to be less of one this morning, has flared up again. Have we heard any messaging? I know that I'm trying to read through what the president is saying on NBC. I've not seen him speak about Iran yet. But do we have any idea where this goes from here? We saw Pete Hegseth tweeting very aggressively threats at Iran, saying we're going to come after you. Where does this lie? It seems like there are no current negotiations happening, but Gulf allies are again being hit this morning, and there's a debate between countries whether or not the strait is open or closed.
That's right. We've had Iran say that it's closed. We've had the U.S. Central Command this morning say, no, it's open, and that U.S. forces are there to help provide some amount of freedom of navigation. We have really no clarity at all on where this is going to be headed. We've seen a lot of this sort of low-level tit-for-tat strikes where the U.S. hits a couple of things and Iran retaliates. That happened again overnight. For the third time this week, in fact, U.S. Did launch some strikes. This came after the Iranians Iranians struck a ship, a commercial ship, did some damage to it in the Strait. And then Iran retaliated with some hitting out at several of its neighbors that it says has been supporting the U.S. operation. And so it has been going on at this slightly low level. It hasn't been yet enough to sort of get us back to the full-blown conflict. And Trump in particular has said that talks can still continue even if there's no ceasefire. But it's not clear that really meaningful negotiations are happening. So I think it's going to be up to some of these shippers, commercial shippers, to decide what level of risk they want to tolerate, up to the U.S. military to decide just how much active escorting they want to do or not do, and then up to President Trump to figure out whether he still sees a path forward or whether he wants to go back to a bigger conflict. And again, this is probably the kind of situation where up until basically today, Lindsey Graham would have been in that conversation, would have been part of that, and would likely have been pushing it on a much more hawkish approach down the line. So that'll be one less voice in that conversation as Trump tries to decide how to handle the current situation.
Kevin Whitelaw, senior editor in our Washington bureau. Dan Williams, Jerusalem reporter for us, joining us this morning. Eric Wasson, who covers the Hill, as we continue to process this news that Senator Lindsey Graham passed away overnight at the age of 71. And Christina, just picking up on what Kevin was laying out there and the conversation that we had earlier in the show with the beer, a number of nations hit last night by Iran. Yes, we're focused on kind of this dynamic, this binary dynamic between the U.S. and Iran, but a lot of these Gulf nations hit over the course of last night. One wonders what a forcing mechanism that's likely to be here for further talks.
That's right, and increased frustration from allies in the Gulf. We know the Qataris have been trying to restart this, other Gulf allies as well. Unclear what role Oman is playing at the moment because, again, still frustrated from how that worked out in that first negotiation where they feel like they were played. But this is going to be the new reality for these allies, and it's very, very frustrating, I think, for folks who feel like they've had a good relationship with the White House, but their needs are not really being met by the status quo of this conflict.
President Trump on Meet the Press right now is saying the Strait of Hormuz is open. Quote, we bombed the hell out of them. We're going to talk about this more here over the course of the next hour. Coming up, we're going to talk to Congressman Greg Stanton. He is a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. We're going to discuss the latest in Iran and U.S. retaliation in that region. That is straight ahead on Bloomberg This Weekend, on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. Stay with us.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's update you on today's top stories. The death toll from the twin earthquakes that struck northern Venezuela more than 2 weeks ago continues to climb. During a news conference yesterday, authorities said they are carefully removing millions of tons of debris to avoid harming any survivors as the number of those killed rises above 4,300. Rescue efforts remain active at 2 sites with the help of international rescue teams. New York City's Guggenheim Museum is among a number of Manhattan buildings that have tested positive for the bacteria that causes Legionnaire's disease. The city health department said the popular art museum, well, it has cleaned and disinfected its cooling tower. More than 50 people have been sickened in the Upper East Side outbreak, but none have died. A parasitic infection commonly linked to fresh fruits and vegetables causing severe gastrointestinal issues, well, it continues to spread, according to NBC News' latest tally based on information from state health departments. As of July 10th, over 3,000 cases of Cyclospora have been reported. Health officials advise the public wash all produce before eating it. And listen to this. Americans using prediction markets to bet on the World Cup may face a lighter tax burden than those wagering through sports books. That's because the tax treatment of prediction market bets is unclear, with the question being whether payouts are considered gambling or proceeds from financial instruments. Now, some tax experts say the prediction market payouts could be treated as capital gains, allowing for more generous loss deductions. Kind of interesting there. David and Christina.
Lisa, thank you. The Cyclospora, no joke. You were watching quite cautiously as I had a salad at lunch last week. I'm fine.
We went out with, there were 4 of us. 2 of us ate the salad. 2 of us did not.
It's all right, but no.
But I feel like this is most of the things I eat are now on this list.
Well,
but
yeah, continue to track that. But this is a growing problem, obviously, here in New York, but in many other states as well.
Yeah, I ran into somebody yesterday who said they'd gotten it and had to go to the doctor and get on some really strong antibiotics. So does not sound fun. All right.
Lisa, thank you for that update. Overnight, the U.S. launched new strikes on Iran. This latest strike set follows Tehran targeting a vessel in the Strait of Hormuz. According to the U.S. military, now the key shipping choke point is closed to traffic once again.
Joining us now is Arizona Democratic Congressman Greg Stanton. He serves on the Foreign Affairs, Transportation, and Infrastructure Committees, as well as Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the U.S. and China. Congressman, we do want to talk about China, but first I think we've got to talk about Iran. What is your understanding of the status of the Strait? Iran is saying it's closed. The U.S. is saying it's open. Is that an argument that doesn't need to be? Because if there's any uncertainty, as we talk about here often on Bloomberg, people are not going to want to risk it.
I mean, up to the exact minute, we don't know what the situation is. Here's what we do know. The Strait of Hormuz was open before Donald Trump entered into this war of choice. And what a terrible decision that was. It's obviously increased gas prices for the American people and for our allies around the globe. And we don't know what his strategy or plan is with this war. Obviously, he was trying to negotiate a settlement. We wanted a negotiated settlement. It didn't work. And now we're back in an active war with no end in sight, no solution to the Iran nuclear problem. They can never have a nuclear weapon. But what is our plan to actually accomplish that? The ballistic missile program of Iran. Originally, that was one of the goals of this war, was to end that program. No indication that is still a goal of this administration, ending their support for terrorist proxies in the region. This is a disaster, this war of choice. The president first took us out of the JCPOA in his first term, the Iran nuclear agreement. What a mistake that was. And now compounding it by this ongoing war of choice.
We understand that the foreign minister of Iran traveled to Amman yesterday for meetings. Unclear if any U.S. representatives were there. And this is something that we talked about with a colleague of yours on the Foreign Affairs Committee. The chairman emeritus, Michael McCall, was with us yesterday. And I just asked him about the level of engagement as he sees it from this White House with these talks. The president saying the ceasefire is over, but giving the kind of imprimatur to Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner to continue having these talks if they want to paraphrase what the president said. Let's take a listen to what Chairman Emeritus McCall said to us yesterday.
Iran they're not stupid. I don't trust them. I don't think they negotiate in good faith. They know the midterm elections are coming up. They know that if energy prices escalate, that's going to hurt my party. The worst thing that could happen is we negotiate a really bad deal for political reasons before the midterm elections. Now that we're in, and we're seem to be all in, we need to do this correctly. But, I don't think the American people have a lot of patience, to be honest with you. And when they fill up their gas tanks, I filled mine up when I was home in Austin, and, it was $100. And so the American people are fatigued.
American people are fatigued. That stuck with me. Another thing he said did as well, we need to do this correctly. And I wonder, Congressman, if you have confidence that as these talks unfold so much as they are being done correctly, to borrow a phrase from the congressman.
Well, Chairman McCall said he was worried about the United States entering into a bad deal. We did enter into a bad deal. As you know, the agreement that this administration had reached with Iran, the one that's now been breached and now there's ongoing violence, but the agreement was a terrible one for the United States because we gave up all of the sanction relief immediately, and all for the promise that negotiations would be ongoing to end the Iran nuclear program and to get rid of the enriched uranium that still exists inside of Iran. But we didn't create like the JCPOA. The sanctions relief would be gradual over time as Iran showed commitment and that they were actually following the agreement, holding up their end of the agreement. Under the agreement that Donald Trump made with Iran, all of the sanctions relief was upfront, and the ability of Iran to still charge ships fees for crossing the Strait of Hormuz. And so we need a new deal. We need a deal that actually builds accountability for Iran. I agree with Michael McCall that we can't trust this regime. They consistently lie. But it just goes to show you, entering into this war of choice by Trump, what a terrible foreign policy decision that's going to have bad reactions for the people of America for years and possibly decades to come.
All right, so what do you do about this then? Because obviously your party is in the minority, but I'm wondering if you're sensing any similar frustration from Republican counterparts in Congress, and if you think the loss of someone like Senator Graham, who usually was very stalwartly loyal to the president, but did express skepticism about this deal and could at times be a go-between Congress and the president, if his loss is going to make any kind of dissent with the White House even harder.
Well, first off, rest in peace, Senator Lindsey Graham. He was a good friend to our senator from Arizona, Senator John McCain, and we appreciate him for that close working relationship. And he was a friend of the people of Ukraine, and he was a hawk on issues of Iran. I disagreed with him on numerous other political issues, but rest in peace. And he was a critic of this agreement that the president had come to with Iran for the exact reason I just stated. It gave all the benefits to Iran up front without having to build up accountability. And so it was almost doomed to failure. And he understood that the Strait of Hormuz was open before this war. The negotiations that were going on before entering into active shooting and missiles, the negotiations would have continued to allow the Strait of Hormuz to be open. But now that Iran has shown that they can close the Strait of Hormuz with drones going after ships in the region, it's going to be tough to put that genie back in the bottle. But that's exactly what this president and his team have to do, is to negotiate an open Strait of Hormuz, absolutely essential for the world economy.
A lot of news this morning. Some news about another one of your colleagues, Khanna, the gentleman from California. He tweeted this yesterday on a trip that he made to the Middle East. Israeli settlers brandishing American-made M4s detained me and other Americans on my trip to Palestine. When the IDF arrived, they sided with the settlers and continued our detention. They made a huge mistake, he said. And he went on to tell the New York Times in an interview that he did with that newspaper that he felt powerless in that situation. He was eventually allowed to continue his journey after calls to the U.S. Embassy and Israeli police. But he says, imagine how people feel every day. I wonder what this incident says to you about the state of play in Israel, in that region more broadly, and sort of the faith that you have in the Israeli government at this point.
Well, look, Khanna is right that this was a huge mistake. He's an American congressman. He's doing due diligence. He's trying to do fact-finding mission, particularly what's going on in the West Bank and the issue of settler violence in the West Bank. He should be doing that on behalf of his constituents. And he chairs the committee, or ranking member, of the committee that I'm on, the China Select Committee. So he's doing important work for the American people, regardless of what you think of him politically, he needs to be doing this kind of work to see with his own eyes what's going on. And of course, if we're ever going to get a long-term peaceful solution in the Middle East, in Israel, between Israel and the Palestinian people, a two-state solution, which still needs to be the goal of United States diplomacy in that region and our relationship with Israel and the Palestinian people, that needs to be our North Star, if you will. And the settler violence that's going on in the West Bank is a massive problem to achieving that. It makes it virtually impossible to achieve that. That's got to stop. And he was doing important work, and it's totally unacceptable what happened to Khanna in the West Bank.
On a diplomatic level, it also seems to point out a few problematic things. These Caudles, these trips don't just happen spontaneously. There's a lot of planning, there's a lot of security, usually a lot of coordination between governments that indicates to me that possibly either that coordination wasn't happening at a sufficient enough level, or perhaps there's a lack of something we talked about on the show, command and control with those forces in certain areas of that country. Are you concerned there are bigger issues at play here, even than this incident, which is quite a big deal?
I don't want to speculate on that, but it's just completely unacceptable under any circumstances that settlers would detain Americans, and in this case, an American member of the United States Congress who was there on a fact-finding mission, which is important work to be done on behalf of the American people. And again, we know that it's always been the United States goal in our diplomacy in that region to get to a two-state solution. That's the only way to have long-term peace in the region. And the activities of settlers and settler violence is a huge impediment to that. And it's important for members of Congress to do this work and see it with their own two eyes. And yeah, what happened is completely unacceptable, regardless of the circumstances.
Mentioned a couple times that select committee on strategic competition with China, and let me end there. And maybe the way that we can get into that issue is by looking at the U.S.'s decision not to renew the USMCA, that successor to NAFTA. I'm curious what that decision says to you about the way that the U.S. is looking at its relationship with that strategic competitor, with China. What is it going to mean not having that deal codified in a more formal way, having it be subject to more annual renewal, I guess, in the years ahead? What's that going to mean for U.S.-China relations, that level of competition?
Well, I represent Arizona, a border state that has created tens of thousands of jobs as a result of the modernized agreement, the USMCA. So from a financial perspective, both for my community and the rest of the country, a terrible decision of this president. But on a geopolitical scale, the North American region is like over 30% of the world economy. And if we're serious about winning the economic battle with China, and we have to win this economic battle with China, bringing the United States, Canada, and Mexico closer together, acting as partners in North America, is critically important to winning it. As is, by the way, United States having stronger economic ties with Europe and the other Asian nations surrounding China. So the president slapping tariffs on our allies around the globe from a geopolitical perspective of winning this battle with China is a terrible decision. And just, you know what, just insulting Canada, wanting them to be the 51st state, or threatening to unilaterally bomb in Mexico, being belligerent to our next door neighbors. That is terrible foreign policy, terrible diplomacy. We need to decide that these are our partners who are going to work with them, and we need to modernize the USMCA.
We're going to have to leave it there, sir.
Critical trade agreement.
All right, thank you so much, Congressman Greg Stanton, a Democrat from Arizona. We appreciate your time today.
Coming up, our colleague Michael McKee is going to join us as Kevin Warsh prepares to go to Capitol Hill for 2 days of testimony before the House and the Senate. That's coming up next.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Week, and I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's update you on today's top stories. Big news for the Seattle Seahawks. A group led by tech billionaire Vinod Khosla has agreed to buy the NFL team in a deal that Sportico says is valued at $9.6 billion. In a post on social media, Khosla said he was excited to be part of a great franchise. Linda Noskova, she has won her first Grand Slam trophy. The 21-year-old, she recovered from a second set meltdown to overcome Karolina Muchova in the women's final and become the third Czech woman to win Wimbledon in just 4 years. Today, Jannik Sinner and Alexander Zverev go head-to-head in the men's final. The PGA Tour continues with the Genesis Scottish Open at the Renaissance Club. Now, going into the final day of play is a three-way tie at the top of the leaderboard between Min-Woo Lee, Robert McIntyre, and Matt Fitzpatrick. They're all at 12 under par. And World Cup action. Another two teams, well, they are on to the finals. England defeated Norway 2-1 in overtime at Miami Stadium. It was Norway's deepest World Cup run. And Argentina, they topped Switzerland at Kansas City Stadium 3-1. So now the stage is set. You have Argentina taking on England Wednesday and France battling Spain on Tuesday. And speaking of the World Cup, its so-called hiring boost, well, it has yet to materialize ahead of the June 11th kickoff of the soccer tournament. FIFA predicted the event could create the equivalent of 185,000 full-time jobs, primarily in leisure and hospitality. Well, instead, the latest jobs report has showed any pickup in leisure and hospitality jobs in May was completely erased in June, leaving the employment in the sector down by some 21,000 over the past 2 months. David and Christina.
How about that?
Lisa, we talk about this. Same with the Olympics. It's a talk a big game, but sports stadiums, it's going to be a big economic boom, and the results are very seldom that positive.
At least they didn't build any new ones.
That's true. That's true. We have a lot of stadiums in this country. We're doing okay.
Thank you, Lisa.
All right. Ahead of his first appearance in front of Congress, Federal Reserve Chair Kevin Warsh, the Fed is vowing to deliver price stability, even though inflation is still above that central bank's 2% target.
We also got some news there from Fed Chair Kevin Warsh about these 5 task forces he's created on data and inflation and the balance sheet. Michael McKee, our Chief International Economics and Policy Correspondent, here with us in New York on set to break all of this down. Let's start with these hearings. You're going to go down to Washington. He's going to speak before the House and the Senate. This is really like one of the first opportunities we'll have to see him, I don't want to say skewered, but grilled by lawmakers about his plans for the organization. What do you expect when he delivers those remarks at the Humphrey Hawkins?
I don't think this will be an opportunity to really skewer him since he just started. Democrats will probably question whether his loyalties are to the president or to the Federal Reserve and the economy, and Republicans will praise him, no doubt. He is going to have a more difficult task than perhaps previous Fed chairs because he doesn't want to give anything away. He doesn't want to say we're leaning this way or we're leaning that way. So I would imagine he'll sort of run through where the economy is and say they're prepared to do whatever they need to do, but price stability is our guiding star.
Do you think we're going to hear a lot about these task force? Last time you and I were talking, we were saying they have these different topics, cover a whole bunch of things, and they can be used either way. If there's a policy that Warsh wants to implement but knows the president wouldn't like it, he could say, well, this is what the task force recommends, but it could also go the opposite way as well. It can give him some cover if he's doing a policy that could be less popular within the agency. But he named some names to these task force. I'm wondering if any of them stood out to you. And they seemed pretty interesting and like reputable names that the industry would be okay with.
Oh, but they're all well-known policymakers or economists, and that plays well. The question is, when they report back, what is it that they can actually say or do, or what will he fall back on? And that'll probably be a focus of the questions is, when you get this, how are you thinking you're going to change the Fed? Some of it is the stuff on AI. I mean, who knows? What are you going to do with that? Balance sheet will be interesting. He wants a smaller balance sheet. He's got people on there, Bill White and others, who have argued for smaller balance sheets. So, yeah, he could use that as a push forward. But I think the bottom line on what we get on Tuesday and Wednesday is, if you were running a prediction market, you'd want to bet on the phrase, there's a task force for that.
There's a task force, which he leaned on heavily after that first Fed meeting. Going back to these names, though, I made a joke. You've got like a quarter of the Harvard Econ department there. You got Jeremy Stein, Karen Dinan, Greg Mankiw is on one of these task forces as well. But then there's like Doug McMillon, the former CEO of Walmart, Mark Andreessen as well. I think Doug McMillon's going to be working on data issues. Many of these are names that you know well through covering central banks. What do you make of those other names that aren't necessarily associated with central bank policy?
Well, obviously, Mark Andreessen is an interesting choice because he's been controversial, shall we say, over the past year. Doug McMillon, I think, as somebody put it, who knows more about electronic data gathering than the former head of Walmart? So there's probably going to be some good experience there. The question is, what do you do with the data that they're not doing now? Because the Fed actually gets all kinds of private sector data and tries to incorporate it in all of their thinking about what's going on. So I don't know exactly where that one takes us, other than perhaps they can build support to go to Congress and say you need to give more money to the statistical agencies.
Is there anything you think we'll hear from him in Congress that reporters like yourself, who did an excellent job of questioning him at his first appearance, weren't really able to get to? Is there some long outstanding question that you expect Congress to address?
Well, I think the balance sheet question is something that really didn't come up at the press conference.
It's big. So, it's what, 6.7 trillion now?
So, yes. Yeah. And so how far does he think they can go down? How fast? And where would he leave it? Now, Warsh has expressed the idea of going back to what they call the corridor system, which is scarce reserves, and the Fed is intervening in the market every day to keep interest rates where they are.
What are the risks of that?
Well, the risk of that, well, there's twofold risks. One, it means the Fed has to be much more active, and two, it takes out some of the safety net that banks have right now with excess reserves, and the whole idea of raising capital to try to make them safer goes by the boards. The other issue is that if you have that kind of system, then you're going to lose a lot of jobs on Wall Street that are in the repo market and things like that, because you won't have the kind of trading that we have now.
Let me ask you about inflation. Kind of a two-part question. We got minutes from the last meeting. It seems like there was maybe a more hawkish tilt to those minutes, that there was some division among members of the policy committee on whether or not they thought they should raise rates at that last meeting, and Kevin Warsh's first meeting. The second question on inflation has to do just with what's going to precede Chairman Warsh's testimony on Capitol Hill. We'll get new CPI data. So I guess it's what can we expect from those data next week? And also, what new did you learn about the policymakers' kind of perspective on where inflation is today?
Well, I think they confirmed the idea that they're done with letting inflation get out of control and not come down. They want to really push to bring inflation down. Now, the question that divides them is how restrictive are they right now? Some of them don't think they're restrictive enough, and they wanted to maybe raise rates in June. And we'll still have that pressure in July. But for the most part, I think they're willing to leave interest rates where they are. And if Warsh can do that, that is probably going to be the biggest win he can get on behalf of the president. No rate cuts. Now, in terms of the data, we're probably going to see a little tick down in the headline numbers because gasoline prices came down during the month. But now we're back in the same position that we've been forever of Groundhog Day, because now gasoline prices are going back up again. And so the July numbers, which we'll get in August, are going to tell a different story. So for the Fed, it's just keep plowing ahead with interest rates where they are, at least, and see what happens in other parts of the economy besides energy, and maybe you have to respond.
About half the members said they were pricing in essentially a rate hike by the end of the year. Is that not the case anymore? Do you think that they will hold throughout the end of the year? Or is it just too soon to tell? I mean, there's so many uncertainties. I can't imagine trying to make economic policy. And this is one of the arguments from Warsh when it comes to the dot plot, right? Those forward projections are not always necessarily useful, and they can kind of be a wagging the dog kind of issue. But where do you go from here? And do you think that stands, that we're not going to see a rate hike before the end of the year?
Well, I was just looking before the show at the latest projections by the markets in terms of futures and interest rate swaps, and they're basically still pricing in 1.5 increases by the end of the year. And I think I would have bet you a week and a half ago or a week ago that they were going to stay on hold for the whole year. But now we're back at war again, and energy prices are going up again. And so, there is a chance that they're going to have to raise rates. But nobody really knows, and that's the hard part. I suppose if you're Kevin Warsh and you don't want to give guidance, this is a good thing for you, because you have no idea what's going to happen going forward.
I generally have no idea what's happening going forward.
There you go. International economics and policy correspondent hitting up Warp Go on the terminal here on a Sunday morning before joining us. Appreciate that, Mike.
Some excellent boots. I know we showed Caleb's footwear earlier, but all right, ahead. Food under fire. And one journalist took her experiences in war zones and made them into a gastronomical experience. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Christina Ruffini alongside David Gura. Around the world, numerous wars and conflicts are destroying the day-to-day lives of many civilians. And one blog has gone to try to unite what pulls us all together in these hard times. What is that force? Well, it's food.
Food Under Fire is a blog dedicated to the proposition that amazing food can be found on the road, even in the farthest flung, craziest corners of the world. We sat down with the creator of Food Under Fire, that's Erin Lyall, to ask her how she came up with this idea for a blog.
Well, I've been long obsessed with food, obviously. And I moved to London 12 years ago for CBS and started covering conflicts once I moved here. And one of the first conflicts I went to was in Ukraine. It was 2014, and the revolution was happening in the Maidan. And what was amazing about it was freezing outside. All these people were out there kitted out in colanders on their head and mattresses as sort of shields. And there were little old ladies wandering around the square, pushing around carts of hot soup, handing out hard-boiled eggs, dishing out big bowls of grains. And I was going, oh my God, like this is how you feed a revolution. And it's as fascinating as the actual revolution that we're watching here. So I started this food blog because I think people generally find it fascinating how we feed ourselves, how we bring ourselves comfort, how we survive in areas that are under siege, that are difficult to live in. And so I started about 12 years ago. And now every time I travel, I try to find a very specific moment to blog about that will sort of shed a bit of light on something we don't actually get to cover as we're telling news stories.
So we've been talking about Ukraine. Give us a favorite moment or meal that you've had elsewhere in the world.
Elsewhere in the world, I mean, I've had some amazing experiences in Gaza back in sort of 2014, 2019, before this current conflict, where we got invited into people's homes and all the women cooked for days, giant platters of meat and rice. And they took us to their watermelon farm and we cut open a fresh watermelon and we ate it with sort of those big tins of salty white cheese that you'll find in kind of Arabic markets, and some mint and some fresh bread. And, you sit in these environments having this shared experience with people and just go, oh, wow, like life is happening all around. It's not just war all the time. It's not just destruction. There, people are sharing themselves, sharing their love. And I've been lucky enough to sort of stumble into those kinds of experiences in most of the places we go.
Do you find that some of the poorest, most destitute places, they're the most generous with what they do have to offer? I'm always surprised by when you go to really wealthy countries, that's not the case. And when you go to places where you think people are just surviving day to day, they're almost always the first ones to invite you into their homes.
Yeah, the Anglo-Saxon world is probably the worst at this kind of hospitality. But the Middle East, Ukraine, we'll go to these places where people have lost so much. And it doesn't even have to be war. It could be a natural disaster. It could be Haiti. And suddenly they're cooking everything they have. They're inviting you to sit at the table. And they're giving everything they have, even if it's not a lot. And it's such a privilege to get to experience those kind of moments. And when I was in Ukraine, when the city of Kherson was liberated from Russian occupation, and we were trying to get into the city, we got as far as the city limits, and then they wouldn't let us in. And it was too far to drive back. So I just stopped this old man in the street and said, is there a guest house in this village that we can stay at? And he said, well, you're staying at my house, obviously. We have food, we have blankets, and we have lady wine for you.
What is lady wine?
I mean, I'm sold at wine, but what is lady wine? And he's like, well, it's slightly softer for the ladies, so it's, not too hard for you. I said, great. So we went to their house, and this little old couple cooked everything they had in their kitchen, like giant bowls of pasta, canned, marinated tomatoes and peppers, a big bowl of pickled cabbage, little toasts with pork fat on them and sliced sausage and more pickles, and then giant jugs of homemade lady wine and vodka and male wine, I guess. And it was just, it was such an experience because, also for them to be able to host people after, 6 months of occupation, to be able to unload the trauma that they had lived through and have this captive audience sharing the moment with them and sharing the joy. And it was one of the highlights of my life, not to mention my work,
You've been doing this for more than a decade, and I'm curious what you've learned about your readers. Who's coming to you? What kind of interactions have you had with folks who are reading your updates and your dispatches on your blog?
I get readers from all over the world, mostly America, UK, because I write in English. But I think people really connect to these stories in a way that they don't connect to sort of a television package about what's going on in a war zone. Because they can put themselves in it. There's a real empathy driver there when you're reading about what it's like in someone's home, or even how soldiers are living on the front line. They're living in a trench, but in that trench, they've got a makeshift kitchen. They've got soup on the stove. They're ladling out grains, and you can really imagine what it's like to be in the situation. So I do get a lot of feedback where people just go, wow. And also this, in the same vein as you just said, people are continually impressed with the generosity and hospitality that we stumble into around the world. It's beautiful, really.
Erin Lyall, the blog is Food Under Fire. And, sounds like a great topic for a book. I'm just saying. Thanks so much for coming on. It's nice to see you.
We talked about memorable meals. You wanted to bring up this pork that you have to eat in Ukraine all the time.
Yeah,
memorable in its own way.
It is. It's not bad, but it's very Ukrainian and Polish, and it is like toast with slices of raw pork, and it starts almost every meal. Erin had it on her blog, and I got like a visceral reaction to it because I don't eat a lot of meat. I certainly don't eat raw meat.
Raw meat.
And
pork.
But when these people are offering you stuff, you don't want to say no. So and also you're very hungry because you've been in the field all day. It takes some getting used to, but it is nourishing and it's good when it's freezing outside. What's the best meals you guys have ever had on the road?
That's a great question.
I don't know. Like, I never know where to go. That's my whole thing. Like, we're doing a last-minute trip to Puerto Rico, and I'm like Googling like all the different restaurants, like where to go.
I was gonna say I always ask the cameraman, but if it's a vacation, I can't help you, David.
The blog is very cool. I'm going to think about it. I'll tell you next week.
All
right, speaking of next week, thank you for joining us this week on Bloomberg This Weekend. Join our colleagues in Asia this evening when markets kick off at 7 p.m. Eastern. I'm Christina Ruffini.
I'm David Gura with Lisa Mateo. See you next Saturday.